Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here. It's Sunday evening here in London. Hopefully you're having a lovely afternoon there in New York. Um, yeah, David has asked me to give a presentation about Dorico and to answer some questions from you as well. I had shared with David a little plan about the things that I was going to talk about, which he's happy with, and he has also in turn sent me some questions and requests and things from folks who are in attendance. So I will try and get to all of those. As David says, if I'm going too quick or if you want to ask a question that's pertinent to what we're talking about at that moment, please do make it known to me. Once I start sharing my screen and I've got Dorico up on my screen here, I won't really be able to see the Zoom thing very well. So I will try to pause and make sure that there's a chance for people to butt in and
As well, I'll let you know if I'm seeing something. Okay.
great.
Because I'm seeing everything.
Very helpful. Do you know what? I think I will also stick my headphones on because that will then bring all your voices directly into my ears rather than using my speakers here. That will probably help as well. Um, so just before we switch into Dorico, just a quick word about me and about the team. I don't know whether David said my job title or not, but I'm product marketing manager for Dorico, although I'm focused more on the product management side than on the marketing side. Product managers are the people who are the main interface between the customers and the development team. I am the right person to talk to if you have requests and things or questions about how the software works, because in theory, I'm the person who can make sure that it gets changed by talking to the developers. We have a relatively small development team. We're pretty much all based in London or in the surrounding area. We've been at Steinberg now for 12 and a half years, I think, quite a long time. I myself have been working on music notation software for more than 25 years now. I know you can't believe that given how youthful I look, but it's been basically ever since I graduated with my music undergraduate degree, I've basically been working on this stuff. I worked for a long time on Sibelius, and then for the last 12 plus years, I've been working with mostly the same people on Dorico. Um, sorry, excuse me. If you're not familiar with Steinberg, it's a company based in Hamburg. It's been going since 1984. We celebrated our 40th birthday last year. We had a very nice party in Hamburg to celebrate our birthday, which was lovely. And the company's main product is Cubase, which you probably have heard of. And as of the most recent version of Cubase, which came out in November, Cubase now actually has Dorico technology built right into it, in that the scoring features that are in Cubase are now based on the Dorico core technology. I won't be showing Cubase today. I can't really drive Cubase very well, I'm afraid. But if you have any questions about Cubase and Dorico Interop, we can probably talk about those as well. But I can't actually really comfortably demonstrate the software to you. I'm not too proficient with Cubase. Um, yeah, I'm going to jump in now and run Dorico. Well, I have Dorico running, so I'm going to press the share button and hopefully, I have to send a request to David and Tim to allow me to share. There we go. And so now if I press again and if I share my whole desktop, hopefully that will get rid of, oh gosh, okay. So can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Okay. So I will, what I would like to do to begin with is just talk you through the philosophy of Dorico, because I think it's actually I hope that won't sound like too highfalutin and boring, but I'll try to make it concrete in terms of how to understand the software, because I think that is actually one of the challenges with starting to use a new notation program. I understand that some of you in the group are already using Dorico. Some of you might have been using it for a while. Some of you might have been using it only in the recent past, possibly because you've switched over or are in the process of switching over from Finale. And Dorico is quite different from other music notation software. So I thought it might be helpful to give you a few minutes on what we were thinking about when we designed it and how we designed it and how that then impacts the way that you need to sort of think about the software in terms of how you're using it. So I'm going to start a new score, and I'm going to start a completely new score, in fact, because that way I can explain everything as I go. So hopefully you can see my big empty Dorico project window here. When we originally started working on Dorico, it was very important to us. Oh, that's interesting. It's telling me that the audio engine is not going to work. Why is that? Okay, I'm just going to restart Dorico here because I do want to be able to play some stuff back for you. And it's complaining that that's not going to work. So let me just restart and see whether that will be happy on the second. No, it will not. Oh dear. Okay, well, it doesn't really matter if I can't get playback to work, but it would be nice if I could. So let me just run that one more time. Maybe this time it will be happy. Yeah, I think that's looking happier, despite the fact that we're getting the spinning wheel. I think that will actually be okay now. Let's see whether I get the little, yes, good. Okay, so playback should work. Great. So yeah, when we were first designing Dorico, one of the things that we really wanted to make sure of was that it would be really usable on a single display. We know that, some people are lucky enough to have home studios with lots of monitors and so on, and we wanted Dorico to work really nicely in that environment, but we also wanted it to be just as practical to use the software on a laptop with a single screen, or indeed ultimately on an iPad. And eventually we did have an iPad version of Dorico as well, which maybe we'll talk a bit about later on. So everything in Dorico is done in a single project window. There's almost no floating windows and things. There's one for video. You can have the mixer floating out if you want it. You can have the transport window floating out if you want it. But all of those features, apart from the video window, can be done directly inside one window. I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger, but I'm going to just shrink it in a bit from the right-hand side there so that I can still see your lovely faces in the Zoom panel. So everything is basically done in this one window, and as you can see from the toolbar at the top, it's split into these 5 modes. I'm just going to talk you through the modes as we look at the software, basically. And the first and most important place to start is setup mode. If you start a project and you already know what instrumentation you're going to use, string quartet, orchestra, piano and vocal, whatever it's going to be, then you probably won't go into setup mode to begin with. But I wanted to start from a completely empty project because then it gives me a chance to explain to you some of the core ideas of the software through the lens of setup mode. So in each of the modes, you've got panels at the left, at the right, and at the bottom. So here's the left one, and hide it and show it. There's the right one. These are the things I mean when I say panels, and they live in these zones: the left zone, the right zone, the bottom zone. And this middle bit obviously normally has music in it, but right now we don't have any music, so it's showing me an instruction that I need to create some players in order to start working on my score. So let's talk about players first. So uh, again, one of the key philosophical ideas behind Dorico is that we want it to match what you do in real life. So obviously one of the main reasons you might be using a program like Dorico is because you're going to be producing performance materials for humans to play. You're probably not, at least not completely, worrying about only getting playback in the box, so to speak. You probably want to produce some performance materials. And so everything that we've done in Dorico is all about how to make those performance materials as efficiently as possible. And that starts with the idea of players. So in other notation programs like Sibelius and Finale, the highest level thing in the score is a stave. And that stave may be kind of, or a staff if you prefer, and it may be imbued with some properties of the instrument. Maybe it knows what clef it should use, maybe it knows what transposition it should have, and so on. But it is not, for example, clever enough to know that it belongs to an individual human called John or whatever, and John might be playing, say, piccolo and flute, or alto sax and baritone sax, or oboe and cor anglais, or an assortment of wacky smacky percussion instruments and what have you. And that's really what a player is. The idea behind players in Dorico is that you can actually identify the human being that will be holding the instruments, and then that allows you to then treat the person and the instruments separately. So there are 2 types of players. We'll start with a single player. So that would be, as I say, an individual. Let's say it's John or Jackie or whoever. And when you add a player, you get this single little head icon. It's very small, for which I apologize, but hopefully you can see that there's like one little bod's head there. And then you get the instrument picker, you type the kind of instrument you want. Let's start with a flute for no particular reason, press add. And then as soon as we do that, now we have some music. And so now the score appears in the middle there. And we'll talk a bit more about what you can actually see there in a moment. So there is our individual player. And if I click that little triangle, that's then showing me the instrument or instruments that player is holding. So if I press the plus button again, I can then add another player, another instrument to that player. So now we've got flute doubling piccolo held by this one player. And you'll notice in the score, we don't see the piccolo. I mean, in fact, nobody's got any music yet, so we've just got a rest. But if, for example, I were to drag that piccolo above the flute, then you'll see that Dorico shows me the piccolo music instead of the flute music. What's also quite nifty, and again, very unique to Dorico, is that if I then later on in the project discover that actually, well, they can't be doubling flute and piccolo in this way because it turns out the piccolo needs to play at the same time as the third flute or whatever it is, then you can actually grab that piccolo and you can drag it to another player. And now you can see that we've got two staves here because we've got two staves belonging to separate players and we've got instruments, we're showing one stave from each of the instruments here. So then I could, for example, move the piccolo back to our flute player. And as you can see, that second one appears. I could then, for example, make this player have an oboe. And then again, I could add a cor anglais. And you're not going to see the cor anglais stave. And you might wonder, well, how would I write to music for the cor anglais? But we'll come to that. The other type of player is a section player. So if you can look down here in the bottom of the players panel, you can see there's the button for adding a new single player, and there's the button for adding a new section player. And there are two little heads. Two heads are better than one. So when I do that, you see the icon there has two heads. And a section player is different from a single player in that it represents a group of people who all play the same instrument. And so there's a restriction, or rather, there's a different sort of set of behaviors. Single players can hold multiple instruments and they can switch between them. So flute, doubling, piccolo, etc., etc. Section players all hold the same instruments. So they all hold violins or cellos or whatever it might be, and they can't double, but they can divide. So you can take your section player violin and then you can use Dorico's smart divisi features, which I'll show you later on, to then divide that set of desks of first violins or whatever into, two divisions or four divisions or eight divisions or a soloist and everybody else or whatever it is that you might want to do. And Dorico actually understands what that means. So in other programs, you create a stave, you label it as a flute or whatever. When you want to go to a piccolo, you do some kind of crazy machination to, change clefs and transpositions and whatever else you might need to do. And then, worry about the parts later, basically. But in Dorico, it's all driven from this idea about we know who the humans are who are holding these instruments, because that then allows us to make lots and lots of smart decisions down the line. And basically, one of the big philosophical ideas behind Dorico is that we want we want you to be able to change your mind whenever you like and pay the smallest possible penalty for changing your mind. So, for example, if you were in Finale or Sibelius and you wrote a load of music on one stave for flute and then piccolo, and you were using instrument changes to go back and forth between them, and then it turned out that you needed to divide out the music for the piccolo onto another stave, there wouldn't be a quick way of doing that. You would have to go through the entire score, finding the place where you've got the instrument changes, manually copying and pasting the music from the piccolo onto another new stave, and then deleting any extraneous markings, clef changes, and so on that you didn't want on the now individual flute stave. Dorico completely eliminates that kind of labor because you can simply drag that piccolo from player number one to player number two, and everything just updates by magic. And I'll show you that in action a bit later on. Likewise, when you change your mind about divisions, all of that stuff can be revisited at very, very low labor cost, basically, to you. So players are the people who hold the instruments who play the music, and instruments are separate from players and can be moved between players. They can also be changed. So let's say that I don't actually want it to be a piccolo. I want it to be a different instrument. Let's say, for example, piccolo in D flat rather than piccolo in C. I can change it, and then all of the music rather that belongs to that instrument is automatically, transposed in the part and so on as it needs to be. And I don't have to do anything other than just decide to change my mind. Again, if I had clarinets in B flat and it turned out that actually they should be clarinets in A, very, very easy. I just do change instrument, change it to clarinet in A, nothing else to be done. Dorico understands what you mean and it does the right thing. So that's players. The actual music they're playing is what we call a flow. And a flow is one of those words that we used because it doesn't have any particular existing musical meaning. We used it in for two reasons, really. One is because, as I say, it just sort of suggests some kind of music flowing by, but also because Dorico owes some of its design to desktop publishing applications. And in desktop publishing applications, if you're familiar with them, you often have flows of text, and the text flows into frames from column to column or from page to page or whatever it might be. And we wanted to have an allusion to the way that music flows in Dorico, also between frames. And we'll talk about frames later on as well. But taking the musical meaning of flow, or rather the fact that it doesn't have a musical meaning, we decided to use a word like flow because then it would not suggest a particular use case, if you like. Use case is a bit of a computery term. I apologize for that, but I can't really think of a better word for it. But flow doesn't mean movement, or it doesn't mean act, or it doesn't mean recitative, or it doesn't mean footnote, or it doesn't mean, song in a songbook or number in a musical. It's just a span of music. So a flow is literally just a span of music, and you can have as many spans of music in your project as you like. They can be separate movements, they can be separate songs in a songbook or numbers in a musical, they can be separate academic exercises for your students, they can be multiple incipits for some kind of thematic index or whatever it is. They can be anything you like. They just exist in your project. In the normal run of things, you might have a multi-movement work, in which case you'll have one flow for each movement and that's it, and that's easy. But if you're doing a critical edition or something, you might need a mixture of flows that represent individual movements or individual pieces. You might need flows that are going to be for a thematic index. You might need flows for footnotes, and all of those can be mixed together in the same project. Now, at the bottom of the screen here, we have the flows panel. So we have the players panel on the left, the flows panel at the bottom. There's a card for each flow, and I'll explain more about the cards for flows in a minute. To add a new flow, I simply press that button there, and you can see now that I've now got flow 1 and I've got flow 2. And although we've still got no music in the flows, I just want to demonstrate one simple thing, which is that the instrumentation between each flow can be completely independent. So for example, in flow 2, let's say that the oboe and cor anglais doesn't play. So I can simply select flow 2 down here in the flows panel, and you'll see now that the players panel lights up in a different way. You get this darker blue, and you get these checkboxes here that are lit up or not. And so I can then uncheck the checkbox, and that then basically removes that player from that flow. So now flow 2 is just a duet for flute and violin, and the oboe and cor anglais are not there anymore. So flows can be completely independent musically, different key, different time signature, different instrumentation, and there can be as many of them as you need in your project, and you can reorder them. So if I want flow 2 to become the first flow, I simply drag it in the panel like that, or I can reorder them, I can export them, I can import them, I can split them, etc., etc., etc. And we'll get into some more of those things later on. So flow equals chunk of music in your project. Depending on what kind of music you write, you might want to think of it as a song or a movement or a number or whatever it might be. But that is basically just chunks of music in the project. And then the third panel on the right-hand side here is layouts. And again, it's all about making it easy to create the performance materials that you want. So layouts, you can think of them as scores and parts, basically. So by default, whenever you create a player, they get added to the full score layout, of which there's always one by default, and they get their own part layout. And so you then get, for every player, a part layout, and that part layout contains all of the instruments assigned to that player. And if it's a violin one, for example, it will contain all of the divisions that you've created in the Divisi feature if you've used that. So layouts, as I say, they are, you can have as many of them as you like. They can also be custom. So for example, I could create a custom score layout, and I could create then a custom score that contains only flow number 2, and let's say does contain flute and violin, but doesn't contain the oboe, and there is a difference between including a player that isn't playing anything in the flow and excluding it altogether. If you include it and it's not playing in the flow, like for example, you're doing a part layout and your trumpet player is tacit in the third movement or something, in the part, you still want that third flow to be present because then Dorico can show a clever tacit for you automatically. And then the trumpet player knows that he can safely slope off the stage and go to the bar for that movement rather than sitting there wondering whether he should be counting or not. And it doesn't show a bunch of rest, it just says tacit. Whereas if you've got the trumpet player in that third movement and he doesn't have or she doesn't have any music at all, they'll still see all of the bars rest and tempos and rehearsal marks and all the rest of it, multi-rest and so on. And so then they might think, well, maybe I can't go to the bar. Maybe I might have some notes later on. So there's a difference there between those two things. So you can have as many score layouts as you like, as many part layouts, and as many custom scores. Custom scores only contain the things that you want them to. To actually view the different layouts, you use the layout selector here on the toolbar, which is the bar at the top of the window. So you can just switch straight to there. You can see there, for example, is the oboe cor anglais part, and it contains, you can see the difference, flow one. No, I shouldn't have created a flute because now I keep saying flute when I mean to see flow. Flow one is telling you, oh, look, the oboe is going to be the first instrument playing because obviously you don't normally have staff labels at the start of the systems in parts. And then in flow two, where we excluded the oboe and cor anglais player from the flow, it just says tacit. And if we go to the violin part, you'll see that they have rest because they do expect to have some music in that second flow. So that's the sort of the general gist of it. And as I say, if I can go back to the philosophical point again, it's all about you as a composer or an arranger or whatever it is you're doing. In the course of developing your piece, you will make thousands of decisions, and you might need to make some of those decisions a second time. Let's say take the example of percussion. You know, you're working on your percussion score, and you know that ultimately you're going to have four percussionists, but it's not quite clear what the stage layout's going to be in terms of where your percussion instruments are going to go. If it turns out that, let's say you've got so many instruments that you don't want to create a single percussion score part for all four percussionists, you want to create a separate percussion one, percussion two, etc. part for each one. And so in that case, it's actually important that which instrument appears in each of those part layouts matches what percussion one is going to be doing as he or she is kind of moving between the instruments on the stage. And let's say it turns out that the vibraphone and the glockenspiel are going to end up, unlikely case, but they're going to end up at opposite ends of the stage, so they can't be played by the same bit. Or maybe it turns out that you decide to make a different orchestration choice and you actually want the vibes and the glock to be played at the same time, so they have to be played by a different percussionist. Again, in other programs, you've got a lot of jiggery pokery to do there, but in Dorico, you can simply have your four percussionists and they can each have their set of instruments, and you can then simply drag the glockenspiel from one player to the other. You can then also create a custom part that is a percussion score that contains all of the instruments held by all four percussionists and still have separate parts for each of the four percussionists as well. And all of that is completely flexible and is designed to basically roll with the punches that come up as you're developing your ideas, and then as you're getting the piece onto the rehearsal stage or into the recording studio, wherever it's going to be, and the practical decisions that you have to make over and over again in the course of getting your project from start to finish. Dorico is basically trying to help you to make that decision as easily as possible so that there is as little cost as possible to you of the downstream effects of each of those decisions. And that goes for everything. And we'll see plenty more of that when we get into write mode in a moment. Just two more quick things I want to just talk about briefly before we leave setup mode. And that is that Dorico is, again, another key aspect to the philosophy of the software is it's very much driven by options, then by properties, and then by individual edits. And so what do I mean by that? So Dorico has many, many hundreds of rules that govern its behavior in various different areas. And those are expressed to you, the user, through the main options dialogues, which you can find in the library menu, which we see here. There are these 5 here. But they're also tied off the things in setup mode as well. So for example, flows, each flow has a set of notation options which determine, well, I'll show you notation options so you can see. Press that button there. So notation options, basically, for each movement or piece or song or whatever it is in your project, each of these options can be set differently. So, for example, what should the accidental duration rules be? If you're writing sort of common practice music, you probably want the common practice thing where, accidental, of course, applies only to the octave in which it's written. It applies only in the bar in which it's written. You have cautionary accidentals in the following bar. Accidentals in different octaves in the same bar probably need to have a cautionary shown so that the performer isn't confused about whether they should sharpen it or flatten it or whatever it might be. You can also have the second Viennese school where every note has an accidental regardless of whether it's a natural or a sharp, and it's assumed that the accidental applies only to the note on which it's written. And then you can also have the sort of, I hope I won't be showing my prejudice when I say slightly more confusing set of rules that are used in the sort of modernist composers of the early part of the 20th century, where depending on whether you're exactly which of the French composers you're mimicking, accidentals might apply within the same beam group or within a certain number of beats in the bar or whatever it might be. And all of those are taken care of there. There are also options for how rhythms should be spelled. And this is a very, very important area, which we'll get into in a minute. That all of the ways that when you're inputting notes, Dorico decides how to notate those rhythms are governed by these rules. Note grouping and beat grouping, especially important, and we'll look at some examples of these in a minute. How the rest should work, where they should be appeared, how they line up, how they should appear in cues, etc., etc., etc. All of these things can be set on a per flow basis, and those are called notation options. And then for layouts, you've got layout options. And so if you choose a layout in the panel and then you click the little button with the cog on it down here, then all of the options in here are applying to the layout that you've got selected in the layouts panel, or if you're in another mode, it'll be the layout that you're looking at. So if for example, I switch to write mode and look at, say, the flute and piccolo part, when I then go into the layout options dialog, you'll see that on the right-hand side here, that's showing me the options for the flute and piccolo. Now, what's really, really powerful is that I can change appearances for all of the parts, or indeed every single layout, in one go if I want to, just by selecting them all here on the right-hand side. So let's say that, for example, I want all of my parts to be on B5 rather than A4, sorry, B4 rather than B5. That would be a crazy size. And maybe that wouldn't be a good size for you in New York anyway. Maybe you prefer 10 by 9.5 by 12.5, for example. That might be your preferred size. And of course, all of these you can set up as defaults, but I'm here in Europe and I don't have a fancy printer that can print B4, so my parts default to A4. But if I was able to print stuff 9.5 by 12.5, then I could set that as a default. And because I've got all three of those parts chosen, when I press apply, all of those parts now show that page size. If I now look at the layout options dialog with the oboe selected, you'll see that that's updated. Space size or staff size, what my page templates are, we'll cover all of these. Layout options is basically it's sort of a mixture between the overall sort of what you might think of in in Sibelius as document setup, or in Finale as document options, or in Sibelius as multiple part appearance. Those things are done in layout options in Dorico, and of the five options dialogues that Dorico has, three of them are the ones that you will use most of all. Notation options, which for things like accidentals, note grouping, beam grouping, voice positioning, etc. Layout options for things like page size, staff size, bar number frequency, how your time signatures will appear, etc. And then engraving options, which is for more graphical things like how your accidentals are going to be spaced, all the gaps between things, how thick the lines should be, etc., etc., etc. All of those things are then governed by options, and those are global, or at least they operate at the top level. After you've dealt with your options, you should always, you see something you don't like in Dorico, you should always look for something in the library menu to change it. Don't try and change it directly in the score. If you're changing it directly in the score, you're going to need to change it again somewhere else. So start from the highest level that you can, which is options. If you can't find it in an options dialog, you probably aren't looking in the right one, but we'll talk about how to find them. And then only if you need to make an override on an individual item should you then select that thing in the score and then do something in properties. And then finally, when you've exhausted all of those options, then make an individual tweak to an individual item graphically in engrave mode, for example. And again, I'll reinforce these things as I go. Let's actually write some music, because I think that is, again, where I can also show you a little bit of the sort of philosophical ideas behind Dorico. So I've created my flow. I've got my flute, oboe, and violin here. I've got no time signature. I've got no key signature. The whole idea is that I don't need to make those decisions up front. Again, in other programs, one of the very first decisions you're asked to make when you start a new project is what time signature should be in. Now, you may be perfectly happy making that decision at that beginning. You might already have a strong idea about it, but you might not. You might want to try some stuff out. Dorico wants to work with you whichever way you want to work. So I'm just going to start inputting on the flute here. I'm actually going to go into galley view. So at the moment we're looking at page view, and this will be an interesting thing to show you. So galley view is like scroll view in Finale or panorama in Sibelius, and you can see in galley view that actually all of the instruments are present. So do you remember when we were looking in setup mode, we've got our flute player is holding flute and piccolo, and our oboe player is holding oboe and cor. And when I'm in galley view, I can see all of the instruments. So it doesn't matter who they're held by. And this is actually how you write for music on different instruments held by the same player. You switch to galley view, you start writing the other instrument. Dorico takes care of it all when we come back to look at it in page view, which we'll do in a minute. I've got a MIDI keyboard connected to my computer here, but you can use the mouse, you can use your computer keyboard. I'm just going to play in a few notes without worrying about durations and things. And you see that Dorico is happy to just make a completely open meter. In fact, by default, Dorico thinks in open meter. And this, again, is one of the key difference between Dorico and other programs. In other programs, bars are like boxes. Everything has to fit inside bars. If you want to do something where something crosses over a bar, like a tuplet or something, heaven help you, you've got big problems because those programs don't like to work that way. Dorico, on the other hand, basically puts the bars in later. So all the music exists in a stream or in multiple streams, a stream for each voice on each instrument, and it can be manipulated very, very freely and flexibly. And bar lines are just kind of drawn on top effectively. Obviously, Dorico splits things across bar lines and so on intelligently, but bar lines are no obstacle in Dorico, whereas in all other programs, bar lines kind of are little boxes that the music has to fit inside. And if you need things to cross over from one bar to the next, then generally there's a little bit of work involved in fiddling around with that. So here, for example, I've obviously played in the only melody I can ever remember whenever I come to type in music in these demos, which is the minuet from the Anna Magdalena Bach notebook. But of course, it's all quarter notes at the moment. So how would I turn this into the proper rhythm? And again, I just want to demonstrate how flexible Dorico is in its handling of rhythm as well. So I select a few notes, and if I want them to be eighth notes, I can just press 5 on the keyboard. Now that's all very well, but of course the rhythm of the minuet doesn't go bit mit mit mit. Those should go together. So another one of Dorico's unique features is insert mode. So if I press over here in the toolbox, this on the left-hand side is called the toolbox. This is a panel. So these things with the little icons are called toolboxes. There's another one on the right-hand side. And the things next to the toolboxes are called panels. And on the right-hand side, there's lots of different panels, which we'll be introduced to in a moment. But down here, this says insert mode, which has the shortcut letter I. And so now, when I press 5 for quarter notes, the music closes up. So I can now go through and I can just change each. Oh, hang on. Helps if I don't press the wrong button. I can change all of those notes. Now, what's also fun is that I can take a note, and this is again, try to make Dorico as general as possible. So let's say I just want to lengthen this note. I don't have to type a new duration. I could press 7 to make it into a half note, and all the music would squeeze along, or I could press 5 to make it into an eighth note, and all the music will squudge backwards again. But I can also hold down the Shift key and the Alt key, and I can press right arrow to lengthen it, and I can press left arrow to shorten it. And what's also quite fun is I can select a bunch of notes and I can do it to all of them. Okay, so you see, I can do that and I can press Shift Alt left arrow. So I'm using the arrow keys to move left and right. I'm pressing Shift right arrow to select, and then holding down the Alt key as well, and then pressing left arrow once. And that makes them into eighth notes. I can also just press another number, like 9, and that makes them into double whole notes, for example, like that. And all the music squidges along. Did somebody then do something? Is something appearing in the chat? Sorry, I'm not there's a hand up. Kurt, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, am I coming through?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, so just very quickly, how do you change the increments of the increasing duration or lessening duration?
Great question. So I don't know if you could.
Hold on, Daniel, we didn't hear the question in the
Oh, I
room.
beg your pardon. Let me repeat Kurt's question. So Kurt's question was, how do
And
you change the increments? So when I was pressing Shift Alt right left arrow and I was increasing and decreasing the note durations, how do you change what the increment is? And the answer is that uses the rhythmic grid. Now the rhythmic grid is when I'm inputting notes, you can see these orange lines above the stave. That is the current grid value, and that is shown down here. It's really, really small. I'm just going to bring it up, change the window size a bit. This little menu here is the rhythmic grid. Now again, there's keyboard shortcuts for everything in Dorico. So if I hold down the Option key on my Mac keyboard or Alt on Windows and then press the square bracket keys, which are next to the P key, I can move through. And do you see how as I press the menu down here is changing? So it's now set to quarter note, and the grid above there is set to quarter note rather than eighth note. I make it longer. It's now, shorter. It's now dotted eighth notes. Now it's eighth notes. Now it's dotted 16th notes. Sorry, I'm translating on the fly between English and American English, British English and American English note values. And that always just have to just engage brain a tiny bit to do it. Um, and so that's how you do that. So when you're then lengthening and shortening using Shift Alt left and right arrow, it's going to use that grid value that you see down there in the bottom corner. So now if I select those two quarter notes and I do Shift Alt right arrow, they immediately become half notes because I'm incrementing by quarter notes. Yeah, do you see how that works? And likewise, if I just undo and then I go down to, let's say, dotted 16th notes, then when I increase, they are increased by dotted 16th notes. Now, once you get comfortable with Dorico, there's some other quite cool stuff you can do. So, for example, you can actually set keyboard shortcuts to set to a specific grid value. So, let's say in your particular work, you're quite often going between, I don't know what it might be, dotted eighth notes and dotted quarter notes or something like that. You can then assign a custom keyboard shortcut to set the grid directly rather than going through the values like I was doing with Alt left and right square brackets. You can have one shortcut, might be Control Shift 3 or whatever goes to dotted eighth note, and Control Shift 6 goes to dotted quarter note, and then you can go directly to that and then use Shift Alt left right arrow. So by the time you've got these kind of ideas under your fingers, they're really, really powerful because you can use them everywhere.
Daniel, can I interrupt us?
Please do, David. Yeah.
So are people hearing me in this other mic?
I can hear you okay, so I guess you're coming
All
through.
right. I just wanted to butt in and say, so when somebody has a question pertinent to what's under discussion, raise your hand, and Kurt did do that. But what we want to do, just to make things go more smoothly, I'm going to say, so and so, you have a question, and then we're going to unmute you here. Just and for anybody who has come along since I announced that stuff at the beginning, hello. And if you also want to drop anything in the chat, get my attention, you can do that. That is it. Thank you, Daniel.
Great. Thanks, David. Yes, good point of order. Okay, so now that same shortcut that we were just talking about, Shift Alt left right arrow, that also works with every other kind of notation that has a duration in Dorico, which I'll show you in a minute. And again, another of our core philosophical ideas is try to have the smallest number of things that you need to remember and then apply them everywhere. So that's really the goal. Once you kind of know how durations work and how lengthening and shortening things and how moving things work, you can generally be confident that everything works that way. So anything that has a rhythmic position can be moved. So for example, if I select this quarter note here, so we were using Shift Alt left and right arrow to lengthen and shorten using the grid. If I now do just Alt on its own left and right, that moves that item by the grid. So again, if I move it back there, I change the grid to be quarter note, and then I do Alt right arrow, that moves it by a quarter note each time. Okay. And because we've got insert mode activated, what's really fun is it's actually swapping those notes around. Dorico is really immensely powerful when it comes to the manipulation of rhythmic material and melodic material. There's all sorts of transformations, which hopefully, if I don't go on at enormous length, we can get into them later on as well. So I talked a minute ago about bar lines. We obviously need to put some bar lines in this particular piece, so let's do that now. So to put in a time signature, this will be our first chance to see the panels on the right-hand side. So they basically sort of go roughly in order from left to right as how you see them in a score. Clefs, key signatures, time signatures, tempos, dynamics, ornaments, blah, 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 blah. So I can just create a 3/4 time signature just by clicking there. And you can see that Dorico immediately bars all the music as you would expect. Okay. Now I'm going to get rid of that panel because I don't want to see it anymore. Really, the quick way in Dorico to input stuff, and again, another of our core philosophies is learn a few keyboard shortcuts. So if I wanted to put in a time signature, I can also do it by typing Shift and then M. And Shift and a letter is another really, really important pattern to remember because that is how you get to what we call popovers. And popovers are little texty boxes like this that allow you to then create something using the keyboard and hopefully using a fairly natural sort of languagey way of doing it. So let's say that instead of putting it in 3/4, I want to go into 6/8. I type 6, I type slash, I type 8, I press return, and the music is immediately rebarred. And you'll notice, of course, the bar lengths are the same, but now instead of being triple simple time, it's now duple compound time. And so now the music has been rebarred and looks and feels completely different. What if I was to go to 11/16? What will happen then? Well, it all works fine. What if I go to 31/32s? It will be a little bit of a mess, but what's fun is if I go straight back to 3/4 again, everything is fine. So you get the idea that Dorico's rhythmic editing is non-destructive. You can basically always, unless you do some things to do with forced duration, which we'll probably talk a bit about later on when dealing with rhythmic grouping, you can always get back to where you were. This is again part of that philosophy that we have, that you should be able to make and remake any musical decision over and over again in the course of working on your project, and you should never pay a penalty for it. So if you end up through fair means or foul with your music notated in this sort of rather confusing way, like let's say you've shuffled everything along by a 16th note. In fact, let's do that. If I start inputting 16th notes here at the beginning of this bar, you see that everything goes nuts. But as soon as things become simple again, they become notated in a simple way again. Okay, so you're never going to pay a penalty for changing your mind. Here's another fun thing. If I create a tuplet here, so tuplets we do with, so we can either use the toolbox on the left-hand side here, but I'm going to use the shortcut. So it's semicolon. Why is it semicolon? Well, because the key with a semicolon on it also has the colon on it. The colon is the thing that the separator in a ratio. A tuplet is a ratio. So we use semicolon to start a tuplet and colon, which is shift semicolon, to stop a tuplet. So I press semicolon, I get suggested that I should create one that's a triplet. That's fine, but maybe I want to do 5 in the time of 4. Now I've got quarter notes selected over here. There's no way that 5 in the time of 4 quarter notes is going to fit inside this bar. And indeed, sure enough, it will not. But Dorico will nevertheless let me create it quite happily. And then it will give me 5 in the time of 8 16th notes on the left-hand side of the bar line, and then 15 in the time of 16 8th notes on the right-hand side of the bar line. And I can then happily type music in here and everything will work just brilliantly. And if I then change this time signature to be something long enough, like 9/4, you'll see that actually that's totally fine. And in fact, if I want to, here's the first appearance of the properties panel. I can even say spans bar line and get Dorico to draw it in that way, rather than splitting it across the bar line as 5 in the time of 8 and then 15 in the time of 16. I can have it span the bar line like that. And what's really fun is if I then start being really mean to Dorico and let's say inserting 32nd notes before that, it will happily deal with any horrors that might occur. All of that is completely mathematically fine. And in fact, if I make it even harder on Dorico by just turning off that spans bar line property again, oh my goodness me, please don't ever put this music in front of a real human musician. But the nice thing is that if we eventually get back to a place where Dorico can notate it more clearly, as I think we did somewhere, there we are, it will do so. And again, it's completely non-destructive. So if I grab all that music and delete it then everything is fine. Turn on spans bar line, life is great. Hopefully you get an idea about how forgiving Dorico is. And again, another one of our core ideas, we want Dorico to not just be a great musical typewriter, where once you've got the musical figured out and you just want to create a fair copy, you can sit with your chicken scratch manuscript, or maybe you've got beautiful manuscript. I do not. My manuscript certainly is chicken scraps. Chicken scraps, well, probably in musical content, probably is. But you can sit and you can type it all in exactly as you've already figured it out. But also, Dorico is forgiving enough that you can actually generate your ideas at the keyboard, at the MIDI keyboard, at the computer keyboard, into the software directly, and it will always allow you to remake those decisions as you go. Let's just do a few other notations. I said already that a few shortcuts that you learn can be really, really valuably reapplied. Let's look at slurs, for example. So if I press S, that's a good shortcut for a slur. And then based on what we already know, that if we want to make something longer, we do Shift-Alt-Right arrow. I can do that with my slurs and away they go like that. Again, I can do Shift-Alt-Left arrow to bring it in like that. Now, slurs are a bit different in as much as you can't have a slur that goes it doesn't sort of ends between two notes. So when you move a slur with Shift-Alt-Right arrow or left arrow, it doesn't use the grid. It goes to the next or previous note or chord. Okay, so Dorico tries to have, even though things are applied as consistently as possible, consistency never gets in the way of it being sensible musically. So because it wouldn't be sensible to have a slur floating halfway between that quarter note that I'm on now and the next eighth note there, you don't go there, even if the grid, which it currently isn't, were set to eighth note as it is now, it won't go in between. It always just goes to the next note or chord. Okay, so you can do that. What about dynamics, let's say? So again, with dynamics, there's a panel on the right-hand side here, exactly where you'd expect to find it. And you can, for example, so you can just click them in with the mouse. I should show you that you can do that. You've got the mouse pointer loaded with a hairpin, and I can click and drag like that, of course. Don't have to hold down Control and double click and drag. It's not Finale, thank goodness. You can just click and drag, and then it goes. But you can also, which is my preferred way of putting them in, use a popover. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to create between here and here, piano, crescendo, diminuendo, piano again. So I do Shift D, I do piano. I do the thing on my keyboard that looks like a hairpin, which is the less than sign. Then I do that. And let's say we only want to go down to mezzo piano, and you see how that works. But I can also do this. I can show the caret. I can start typing dynamics with Shift D. I can type P, and then I can type start a hairpin. I press return. I get my P immediately, but I don't see the hairpin yet because the hairpin doesn't have a duration yet because I haven't moved the caret. But as I move the caret with with space, I beg your pardon, I'm growing the hairpin. When I get to the point where I want to put in another dynamic or change direction, so I put in forte and then diminuendo, and then off I go again. And then when I get to the note where I want it all to end, I can do PP. Or if I want it to end without a dynamic at that point, I can press exclamation mark. Can't remember why we chose exclamation mark. There was a good reason, but I can't remember what it is. Oh, sorry, I mean question mark. So there is a good reason, which is why I can't remember it, because question mark is right next to the hairpin keys, and that's why we chose question mark, because it's right next to less than and greater than, and that stops it like that. And again, once I've got a hairpin, if I want to make it longer or shorter, I can press Shift-Alt-Right arrow. And you see how, because that's all one group, that is then moving that forte. I can also select that forte and I can move that by dragging it with the mouse, and that then changes the inflection point in that group for where the height of the dynamic is. Again, with our slurs, do you remember how we could use Alt left and right to move notes? I can use that to move slurs as well. That's not massively useful, but it is possible, and it's nice and consistent. How do I create a key signature? Hopefully by now you can guess that I'm going to use a popover to do it. If it was Shift M for meter, if it was Shift D for dynamics, you won't get a prize if you guess that it's Shift K for key signature. But I can type Shift K and type capital G for G major. I can also type 1S for 1 sharp, for example. And now I put in my key signature, you see that, of course, now the F sharp accidentals now disappear. If I want G minor, I do lowercase g. If I want D flat major, I do capital D, lowercase b flat. If I want D flat minor, I do lowercase d, lowercase b flat. That's also how I get to E flat minor, by the way. Dorico can do any key signature up to 7 flats or 7 sharps. You can't do any more. So by the time you've got more than one double flat or double sharp, Dorico says, "No, that's not really a key signature anymore. You better probably use accidentals for that." But you can get up to 7 sharps and flats in your key signature. So that's basically every diatonic step having an alteration. You can also create, I probably won't get into it unless somebody asks me later on, but you can also create microtonal key signatures, custom key signatures like Bartók's Microcosmos with, representing modes or scales of limited transposition, whatever it is you might need, all of that's in there. You can do all of that stuff as well. Tempo, again, no prizes for guessing how you put in a tempo. Shift T, again, it's right here on the right-hand side. I can choose from a menu of existing immediate tempo changes or gradual tempo changes, but it's much more fun to just type my own. I do Shift T, I type, tempo di minuetto. I can then type Q for quarter note equals, let's say, 96. And when I press return, Dorico formats it nicely. It's lined up with the time signature by default. That is in nice bold type. That is in Roman type. The metronome mark is slightly smaller. The proportions are very nice. It all looks very good. Everything's fantastic. If I want to edit that, all I have to do is double click it. Up comes the popover again. Let's say that I actually want it to be 104. I can just change that like that. Maybe I don't really want it to be tempo di minuetto. Maybe I want it to be tempo di valse or whatever. I can do that. And all of this is undoable, of course. You just do Control Z, just like you would in any other program. I can also, if you see down here in the properties panel, I can, for example, specify that the metronome mark shouldn't appear. It still is going to take effect, and you can see that the tempo BPM is still set to 96. If you can read, that's very small. I can also, for example, show the metronome mark but parenthesize it. I can also specify that, by the way, in the popover. If I want the metronome mark to be parenthesized, I can even type it in that way to begin with, like that, and Dorico will interpret that. If I want it to be approximate, I can say is approximate, and then it'll put in C dot 96. If it should be a range of tempos, I can say that it should be 112 or whatever, etc., etc. So you've got a lot of control over how these things appear. You can also, of course, change all the fonts and things, which we're going to get into later on. So this is all about musical intelligence. Dorico tries to give you as much musical intelligence as possible, and we try to work these things through the entire way that you work with the application. Everything is designed to be as easy as possible to do. Let's just do something slightly more exciting than putting in a dynamic. I'm just going to put in, this is silly, but I'm just going to do it by way of example. If I select this passage here and I want to put in a playing technique, and let's say I want to go sul pont to sul tasto. I know you can't do that on a flute or a piccolo for that matter, but let's just show you how you would do it. I would type Shift P. I would type sul pont. And then I want to go from that to sul tasto. So I type in hyphen and then like a little arrow, like an ASCII arrow. And then I type sul tasto. And then I get, by default, a little filled arrow. And again, I've got this item which I can drag left and right. The arrow is attached. If I can move the beginning of it, I can move the end of it, I can drag that by its little circular handle, I can move the entire thing with Alt, left, right arrow, I can move the end of it with, sorry, no, I have to select the right-hand thing, I can move the, oh yes, of course, I can change the duration of the end of it as well. So if sul tasto should then last until that note, but I, of course, need to move Alt, left, right to move that there. And you see that this is glued together. If I go back to page mode and then I start moving things, everything moves out the way. If I go into engrave mode, which we haven't really talked about yet, and I start moving this thing like this, it's all glued together. Everything in Dorico is designed to make life as easy as possible for you by default. And here's one more really, really important golden rule for Dorico, which is do not change stuff like this before you're finished. So in Dorico, when I make a change in write mode, I'm making a musical change. Okay, so when I move that sul tasto onto the second beat of bar 7, I am saying that in musical terms, that sul tasto instruction takes effect on beat 2 of bar 7. Okay, whereas if I do it in engrave mode, I'm not changing anything about where that's going to appear rhythmically. That's a graphical adjustment only. Okay, so this is a really, really important thing. Write mode, again, core philosophical idea. Write mode is about the musical content. Engrave mode is about graphical tweaking of that musical content. So if I want to make a change to the rhythm or the sort of the timing of those playing techniques. Oh, and by the way, do you see how that one's a continuation? Because actually it starts up here in bar 5 and it's shown in parentheses at the beginning of bar 6. And by the way, you can design your own playing techniques with any symbol you like from any combination of fonts or graphics or whatever you want to do. And you can have these things joined together. And lots of people might mistakenly think that you need to create a playing technique and then a line and then another playing technique, but you don't. Dorico groups them together and that's how you should think of them. But if I'm making musical changes to them, like let's say I don't want to go to Sul Tasto, let's say I want to go, this is insane again, but I want to go to Pits, then I can go into the popover by just selecting it and pressing return, and then I can change it. So now it's somehow, if you could do some kind of phased transition of Arco to Pits, now that's what you've got in these things. And all of this is musical content, whereas when I'm making a change in engrave mode, I can't, for example, change Arco to something else here. That I have to do in write mode. But if I want it to, for some crazy reason, be below the stave here and above the stave here, I can do that in engrave mode. So hopefully you get the general idea about what the separation is there. So again, in Dorico, all of the music goes in write mode. Whatever it is you're creating, all of it goes in write mode. And I've barely scratched the surface of what you can do, but I've realized I've already talked for an hour, basically, just about this simple stuff. So let's quickly whiz through the other modes, and then I can deal with some of the actual questions and things that you've sent me. So engrave mode always shows you page view. So even if I'm looking in galley view in write mode, where I can see all the instruments and so on. Oh, and I didn't show you an instrument change. Let's just quickly do an instrument change. So to go to our piccolo, I just suddenly start writing piccolo music there. And then when I switch back to page view, you'll see that we're flute's there. Then now we have piccolo in D flat. Now in the score, the conductor doesn't get a warning to say take piccolo, but if I look at the part, you'll see that actually, because there's only a 2-bar multi-rest, it doesn't look brilliant by default actually, but you can see that there I get my instruction to take the piccolo, and there I get my label to say that I do actually start playing the piccolo from here, and the warning is in Roman type outside of a box. The label is inside a box. Again, if you want that to be bold or bigger or smaller or whatever, if you want that to say take rather than to, or whatever it is you want it to be, all of that is configurable using options. So you don't need to change anything by hand. You just say, oh, right, do I want all of my instrument change warnings to be in italics, for example? So in that case, I would go to library, paragraph styles, instrument change warnings, and I would say, no, I don't want it to be regular, I want it to be italic. And now that one is also in italic, and any other instrument change warning that you've got in your entire project will also be italicized. Let's say that I don't want to use that particular font, but for the whole thing, I want to use a different font. I go here, I go default text, I choose Avenir next, for example, and now all of my text updates, apart from tempos actually, because they are font style. So I do have to change one more thing, which is in here. I change that to Avenir next as well. And now everything is in Avenir, just like that. So again, this shows you the power of changing things globally in Dorico. Change things globally, don't change things locally. One more thing that I should mention is what's this grey line that we're seeing here? That is a thing called the system track. And the system track is quite a useful beastie because it allows you to do things like, so actually it's more useful in the score. But in the score, for example, if I want to select all of the music on all of these instruments, I can do that with the system track. It's easier than kind of doing this kind of selection. It's a bit fiddly. So I can select all of it and I can do that, and that selects everything. I can also, for example, add a bar there. So I can click that little signposty thing there and that adds a bar at that position, or I can delete a bar. So I can select that thing there and I can click that little that little trash can, and that will then delete that bar. The no entry sign does something different, which we should probably talk about very briefly as well, which is for insert mode. So if I'm using insert mode, we'll just go back to galley view again for this, and let's say that I don't want let's say here, right? So I put my little no entry sign here. I know that I'm going to make some rhythmic changes in the first 5 bars, but I don't want any of the music in bar 6 to be upset. So let's do it without that bar first. So if, for example, I'm inserting some material here, you see that everything is moving along. So what was at the beginning of bar 7 is now, sorry, at the beginning of bar 6 is now in the middle of bar 7. But let's say that I know that bar 6 should always stay put. So I put the stop line on, you get this big red line. So if ever you created this by Dorico and you're not sure what it is by accident, it's called an insert mode stop line. You can get rid of it by pressing the little no entry sign there. You can also just drag it off the score. That gets rid of it as well. But once I've done that, if I start, hopefully this will be reasonably clear to see, so you can see what I'm doing. If I start inputting music, watch what happens when we hit this line. So we're just about to hit it. Now that G is at the end of the bar. I now, right. Do you see now that G that was a quarter note has become an 8th note? Now it's gone all together. Okay, so if the stop line is present, rather than it being able to go in and intrude on the music that's in that bar, as you add more material, it removes it instead. Now, what's a shame is if I press delete or backspace, it doesn't come back again. Of course, if I undo, it does come back again. So if I do that, there we are, you see it's back. So that's what that stop line does. And the system track is really useful. It's also really useful if you're trying to make a selection that should include key signatures and time signatures. So let's say, for example, that I want to copy all of this from here to here, and I want to include the key signature and the time signature because I want to transpose it. So I do that, you'll see that these things, all the system things that apply to all the instruments, they're now blue. That means they will be included. If I then go here and I paste, you'll see that the key signature and the time signature and the tempo are included in the material that's been pasted. So again, I can now select all of this material again, select, and let's say I want to transpose this. I can go to the right menu, I choose transpose. Let's say that I want to go from D flat 4 to well, let's do something that I couldn't do in my head, to G sharp 4. So we're going to transpose up by that rather horrible interval, which is, yeah, a sort of augmented 4th, basically. And that's a nightmare, but it can be done, you see. And now everything that needed to be transposed, including the key signature, is included. Whereas if I don't include the key signature in the selection, so if I go back to here, and I just choose the music of just, say, the flute there, and I transpose, then I can transpose, you know, whatever it is, let's say C to F. So this is just choosing an interval of a 4th, right? When I press, which I can also just choose over here on the left-hand side, of course. But I like the interval calculator because then I don't need to think about, well, hang on a second, is that a, you know, augmented unison, or is it a diminished 5th, or whatever it is? I can just choose the intervals that I want, make sure that I know whether it's going up or down, press apply, and it works it out for me. So that doesn't change the key signature, do you see? Because the key signature wasn't selected. Likewise, if I press delete, only anything that's selected is going to be deleted. Okay, so if I, for example, select, you know, just the dynamics, and you might say, well, how do I select all of these dynamics? Because if I got just the forte selected, that's just going to remove the forte. How do I get rid of that whole group? And the answer is you can use a little feature called select more, which is in the edit menu, and that then works out what would be more of this. And in this case, it'd be all the dynamics in this group, and then I can delete them all like that. If I do select more on a note, by the way, it selects everything in the flow in this case, because we're already in galley view. But if I was on, if it was in page view, it would select first in the bar, then in the system, then in the flow. So there's all sorts of lovely time-saving tricks like that, which, you know, there are so many things in Dorico that will save you time once you've got it under your fingers. Anyway, that was a very long diversion because I hadn't mentioned what the system track was, and I wanted to get us into engrave mode. So engrave mode does a bunch of different jobs. We've already seen how you can grab an item and you can move it with the mouse. So you can just move it if you want to nudge it for whatever reason. You can just move things. Again, you want to move an individual piano, you want to change the angle of a hairpin. Yes, hello.
I wonder if before we dig into engrave mode, and people might be forgetting things they were thinking, anybody have any questions or anything? out there? Oh, in the room. Yeah, related to what we've heard so far. Further question. Okay. All right. Well, yeah, let's crack on. Thank you, Dan.
No problem. So engrave mode does all these different jobs, right? So it can do graphical adjustments of things. So, you want to make tiny adjustments to the angles of tuplets or the hook lengths for tuplets, all that kind of stuff. Again, if you find yourself adjusting the angle, the hook length on a tuplet, think to yourself, do I want all of my tuplets to have a different hook length? Because if I do, I shouldn't do that in engrave mode. I should instead go to engraving options, which is here in the library menu. I should go to tuplets. And then I should have a look at the appearance options, brackets, and for example, hook length is currently 3/4 of a space. I really think it should be 5/6 of a space instead of 3/4 of a space. And now it will be as a result. Oh, hang on. Well, that one's actually overridden. So if I remove that, you'll now see that that it will be. So again, before you start making adjustments in engrave mode, consider, would this be better if I made it as an options change rather than a graphical adjustment? Okay, the next thing that engrave mode is good for. So let's say that, for example, I mean, this is a bad example. So actually, I'm going to open up a real piece of music here, real quick. So if I open a little folder in my downloads folder, which I've put a few things in, yeah. This will do, I think. So here is the beginning of the Foray Requiem. Okay, so now this currently fits on to 13 pages. Wouldn't it be great if this was on 12 pages? Because then I could print that out onto a nice little registered booklet, and I wouldn't have one dangly page at the end, because 12 is a good number for that and 13 is a bad number for that. So how am I going to achieve that? So what you can do in engrave mode is you can just go through, and again, this, I'm kind of showing you this in the wrong order, but I will go and show you in the right order. I want to just I want to get rid of this. So I need to basically lose 5 bars from earlier in the piece. So what I might do is I might go through here, and then I might say, well, let's move that bar onto the previous system. So I go move to previous system like that. And now that's a bit crowded, that system, but it probably just about works. And now we've got a nice double bar line here at the end of this page. So that's nice. And then let's say I want one more bar on this system, move to previous system. And if you're a Finale user, then you'll know that in Finale, you can do this using, I think it is the staff layout tool, and you can press the up and down arrow key to move a bar from one system to the next. In Dorico, I can do it with the comma and full stop keys. So if I use comma, it moves a bar onto the previous system. If I select something like that. If I use full stop, it moves it onto the next system, although that's not very helpful in that case because I already want that. Have I managed to do it yet? Yes, great. There we go. So now I've got it onto 12 pages. So that's one thing you can do in engrave mode, is change system breaks and frame breaks, or page breaks as you might think of them in other programs. Okay, so that's all great, but I'm going to undo all of that. I'm going to do unlock layout or reset layout. And now I've gone back to having 13 pages again. So how might I otherwise get this down onto 12 pages without doing what I just did? Well, one thing I can do is, now we know this music, if you're familiar with Foray's Requiem, you'll know that there aren't really any notes shorter than eighth notes in the surf movement. It's quite slow. It's at a stately pace. So what I can do is I can say, well, probably I can afford to tighten the music a little bit because I don't need to leave room for 16th notes or 32nd notes, so I can maybe squish the music up rhythmically just a little bit. And I can do that in layout options. So I go to layout options, I go to note spacing. I see here default space for crotchet/quarter note. That's actually the wrong way around. We really should change that. And I'm just going to change that. Instead of being 4 spaces for a quarter note, I'm going to change it to 3.5 spaces, and you'll be amazed at what a difference this makes. So in fact, this now even doesn't quite fill 12 pages. And again, there's no overriding of the individual layouts. You'll see that I now get that nice double bar line at the end of the second page that I had to make an override to get before. And all the music is still nice and legible. Nothing is colliding. All the eighth notes are still nicely spaced. The music is still perfectly legible. But in fact, it maybe is a little bit tighter than I even need it to be if I want it to fit onto 12 pages. So I can use a quarter of a space more, and that will just about get us there as well. Okay, so now we've got a nice full page. Now, what are these bars at the right-hand side of the page? What are they telling us? We've got a green one here, green one here. Do any of them have a color other than green? Hopefully not. So what they tell you is how full that system is. And Dorico will give you purple if the system doesn't have enough music in it, red if the system has too much music in it, and green if it's in the right kind of zone. And if I scroll down to the bottom and then zoom in, because they can be a bit difficult to see otherwise, I'll just explain the numbers that you see down here. So this is telling us that this system makes the little fraction. Let's start with that first. So 134.1 out of 139.4. So that system, between the staff labels on the left-hand side and the right-hand page margin, has 139 spaces of musical space available to it. That music occupies 134 spaces of those 139 spaces using the ideal spacing values that Dorico has calculated, which means that that system is 96.2% full, which is great. That's perfect. Nothing's squished together. Everything looks good. That means that there's only 5 spaces. So if we know that, for example, our quarter note takes up 3 3/4 spaces, we could only fit one more quarter onto that system and then start mucking around with squishing things together. So that system is almost perfectly spaced. The next one will hopefully be very similar. Okay, 133 out of 145, you actually could get more on that system. And in fact, it would be nice to get that bar on that system. So I still might override that one to get that last bar, because that nearly fits. I've got 12 spaces on there, which is enough for 3 beats. But because I know that in fact it's just half notes on this system, that would actually perfectly happily fit on there, and it would squish up a bit and everything would be fine. So I might just select a note on there and just pull that back onto the previous system. And now it's going to tell me that it's over full. It's 1/4 notes more full than it should be. It's 102.7% full. So it is red, but it's only a little bit red. And if we look at it, it's actually fine. Okay, so that's what that means. The other thing, there's another number down here in the bottom corner of the screen. So this is also telling us how full the page is vertically. So horizontal and vertical spacing are very, very important. I will talk in more detail about them in a minute, but I don't want to get too much into it now. But this is telling you that in terms of this particular page, which has 2 systems on it, if I zoom out, you can see there's a system of just the strings and the tenor soloist. And because those 2 systems fit, it is 96.9% full. On the following system, it's 46.9% full, but with only one system. And unfortunately, that means that because another voice comes in here, the soprano soloist, if you know the first movement of the Requiem well, the soprano soloist comes in a few bars after the tenor finishes. And so, oh, it's not soloist, it's just the chorus, of course. It's the chorus in the first movement. But anyway, the sopranos and the chorus come in. And so that means that we can't fit those 2 staves in on this page. So it's a little bit less full than it would ideally be. But if Dorico was to squeeze that second system on, then it would be over full. So on that one, it errs on the side of being under full. And what you could decide to do was, is, as it happens, this is a right-hander and this is a left-hander. So an experienced editor might choose, for example, to balance these, maybe have the horn parts on this system as well, even though they're not playing, maybe even have the soprano stave on this page as well, so that you've got the same staves on the facing pages. That would then make them balanced. Those are things that you can do if you want to. Dorico is just at the moment hiding automatically anything that isn't playing on that system, but you've got lots and lots of control if you want to exert it over that. So page formatting is done in engrave mode as well, but as usual, try to make changes to the options before you change stuff in engrave mode. And I think we're going to talk a bit more about vertical spacing and horizontal spacing a bit later on. So just very quickly to show you that if you do want to change the vertical spacing, you engage that little tool there. You can drag things around. Don't do this. You don't need to do it. Dorico does it all on its own, and we'll talk about the philosophy and the idea behind how to drive that a little bit later. Likewise for horizontal spacing, it doesn't matter how much you move these handles around. Dorico will never pull an extra bar onto the system by you moving these handles, so don't do it. Dorico's music spacing is one of its very, very best things. It spaces music as well as an experienced human engraver does. It does all sorts of incredibly detailed kerning of items, so that things like, a low note followed by a high note, or possibly maybe the other way around. Let's say a high note followed by a low note, and that low note has an accidental, and they're an octave apart. Dorico knows that the accidental on the lower note can tuck in. It does all that without you having to do anything at all. You almost never need to touch Dorico's music spacing. It really is exemplary, and you don't need to mess with it, but the tools are there that you can do that. And then the most interesting tool in engrave mode is the frames tool. Oh, I've switched to the wrong window there. Sorry, I've got lost there. And the frames tool allows you to do again things to do with page templates, which we will talk more about later on. But again, possibly if I open the Smith responses, if I can quickly find that, I can just Smith and Wesson. No, Smith responses. There we are. So if I open this file, again, just quickly show you some frames, and we won't really dwell on this too much because I think we're really thinking about normal music layout rather than this kind of wacky church music stuff here. But you can see that on this page, I've got, if I go into frames mode, I've got lots of separate frames. Blue frames are for music, green frames are for text. And I can actually have as many of these frames as I like in order to create these kinds of layouts very, very easily. I can choose which flows are in each one. Each of these versicles and responses is a separate flow. So a flow can literally be just a little thing that the cantor is singing. We won't get too much into this, but again, I just want to show you there's plenty of power in Dorico's page layout features. So that's how that works. So very, very quickly, and then I will get on to some of the topics that David shared with me ahead of time. Play mode is like a MIDI sequencer. In here, you can work with VST instruments. You've got a full mixer. It's an audio mixer. If I make it taller, you'll see that it even has inserts and sends. You've got more than 30 effects processors built in or included with Dorico. Any of your existing VSTs you can use. You can export stems, you can export mixed audio, you can export all of this stuff, take it into your sequencer, take MIDI files into your sequencer, all of that kind of stuff. Dorico works with many, many different orchestral sound libraries. There are a whole bunch of sounds built in, but you can also use third-party ones. If you've already got Note Performer, which you use with Finale or Sibelius, you can use that with Dorico as well. All of the playback is completely automatic. It plays back dynamics, it plays back all of the playing techniques, it plays back all of the different articulations without you doing anything at all. If you need to use something wild and wacky that nobody else in the Dorico community is using, you can create your own playback templates and set up your own complex playback stuff. So if you've got your own preferred combination of instruments you like to use, you want to use the Hollywood strings, but you want to use the VSL winds, whatever it might be, you can easily set up templates that work all that together. But I'm really not going to get into playback in this session unless there are some questions that come up a little bit later on. But Dorico is incredibly deep in the playback world. I will just show you the key editor as well. If we look at an instrument that's got a bit more music, so for example, let's look at the strings. They've always got lots of nice stuff. So here we've got the piano roll, you've got the velocities down here. We can also look at the dynamics, which show you the actual dynamics in the score. We can zoom in and out to see more of the music in one go. And by the way, you don't have to work here in play mode with this. This is also all possible in write mode. So you can even go into galley view. I'll show you another little fun feature here, which is the instrument filters. So if I create this and then I want to filter for just the strings, for example, like this, now I can do things like show all of the strings in one little window. So I can show viola, cello, double bass, and they're all in there. I can make changes to the playback without affecting the notation. I can draw my own dynamics in here. You really have extremely comprehensive support for producing mock-ups if you need to do that to, you're competing for a commission or whatever it might be, or you need a mock-up for the artistic director you're working with, whatever it might be. Dorico has all the tools to do it. You don't need to go into a sequencer, but I'm really not going to dwell on playback stuff because that could be a whole other session, which maybe we can do if there's demand for it.
Actually, Daniel?
Yeah. One question regarding what you just referenced in playback, and that is what if you just give an example of where you would want playback in some sense to differ from what the written score represented?
So one example that I often give is that in order to trigger, for example, sort of true legatos and recorded string patches and so on, sometimes you need to ensure that the notes overlap by a certain amount in terms of how they're played. Now you can, of course, get Dorico. In fact, by default, Dorico can do that by you put a slur in, Dorico sees a slur, and it says, aha, right, when I see a slur, I need to lengthen the note by 10%, whatever it is that you need to set in your instrument that it triggers then the legato playback. But it might be that, for whatever reason, you don't want to see a slur and you don't even want to see the legato instruction. And so you can then just make a selection of notes, and then you can grab all of them and make them overlap a little bit like that, just like you would in your sequencer. It doesn't change the printed notation, but it does change how it plays back. You might also want, for example, to adjust the velocity, as distinct from the written dynamic, that kind of stuff. So, and of course, if you've played the music in the first place with your MIDI keyboard, then maybe all of the dynamics and things, the velocities are already overridden from Dorico's defaults, in which case they'll be preserved. If you import MIDI that you've recorded in your sequencer, the notation will look beautifully quantized and so on, but all of the humanization of your original performance that you did on your keyboard or your Win controller or whatever will be preserved. But you can basically make edits that do affect the notation. So for example, if I switch to this tool here and then I drag, actually maybe in this particular case, this won't do anything fun, but you can do that kind of thing where you make the note longer and it does change the notated duration. But if I want to do that in a way that doesn't affect the notated duration, I can do that. Do you see how that works?
In Dorico as your DAW for final audio creation, as opposed to simply as a notation composition.
Exactly. And because now so let's say, for example, that you're working with Dorico and Cubase, you can take your Dorico project and you can either export MIDI into Cubase, which might be useful because you want to, for example, that means any key switches, any controllers that are put in for dynamics, all of those will be preserved in the MIDI. And then all you need to do is then in your Cubase project, hook it up to the same instruments, and then you want to do further editing. Or as I said earlier on, you can actually export stems, which include all of the expression. And then let's say, because Dorico's mixer, for example, doesn't support side chaining. So if you need to do really complex effects stuff in order to do sort of more detailed mixing, also there's no audio parameter automation in Dorico. So if you need to parameterize an audio insert or a send in real time, you can't do that in Dorico, but you can export the sort of the dry or even the MIDI, the audio with reverb, and then do your automation inside Cubase or another DAW. Or you can export the Dorico project and take all the notation and take that into Cubase. So all of the MIDI data in Cubase is just based purely on the strictly quantized notation, and then you can add expression from there. So depending on what your workflow is, there's huge flexibility. You can either work completely in Dorico, tweak the playback to your heart's content, use any combination of VST instruments and sound libraries that you want, create your own expression maps, edit the MIDI by hand, or you can go all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you just use, say, Note Performer, which does its own expressive stuff, or Dorico's built-in sounds, and just worry about producing the parts. And then if you then want to take material into the sequencer, you can do it either using audio or using MIDI or using Music XML, or you can take the Dorico notation and use that as the basis of further editing in Cubase.
And Roger, I want to add, you're working on a string piece lately. Something where this can be really useful if you need to make a mock-up is in string music, because for instance, a violinist will see a tenuto mark and can take that to mean different things contextually. It may be you have slurs over a passage and some of the notes have tenuto marks. Well, normally on playback, that's going to alter the behavior of how one note is followed by another when a tenuto is there. And here you can go in there and make that how you want it, because tenuto could be a pressure marking as opposed to duration.
I mean, my one comment on that is anytime I've attempted to offer an audio file to a performer along with notation, they nearly take offense.
Yeah, they naturally,
They need that sort of guidance, so.
naturally.
Sure.
That instance aside, you know, a coffee thrown in your face aside. Okay, Daniel, thank you.
Yeah, great. So as I say, I won't dwell too much on playback there. You know, Dorico is so deep that we could easily spend hours just talking about that. And if there is appetite for that, I'm very happy to spend some more time talking about that in future. And then finally print mode, and then after an hour and a half, we finished our high level tour of Dorico's UI. So when you're actually ready to put material on the stand for people or send PDFs or whatever it is that you need to do, you come to print mode. On the left hand side, you can choose between the different layouts. So and we will talk a bit more about part preparation shortly, but you can see all the parts here. Let's say you want to export everything as PDF. So you go graphics, you go PDF. I'll put it all in there. You can choose my file name options, whatever it is. I press export. It goes biggity bangity bong. And then if I look inside my NYCC folder, here we are. You see there's the full score PDF. And then here is the horn 1 part, all fits nicely on one page. Horn 2. I don't really want a soprano part, but actually here's a great use case for, you know, we could have a custom score here. So we create a custom score, and then we add the first flow to that score, and then we add sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses. Maybe we'll add the soloists as well. And then there's our custom score, and that could be the basis of a rehearsal score. And then maybe, actually, tell you what, maybe we'll add the organ in there as well, even though it's not really a reduction in this case, but it's close enough. You can certainly work from that for this movement. And we'd obviously want to change the space size and so on. Let's make it B4. Let's reduce the stave size to 6 mm. Sorry, I know that's a horrible mixture of imperial and metric measurements. And again, in the layout options, we can just go in here, go to note spacing, just change that to say 3.5. Let's see if we can get it onto a nice number of pages. There we are, 7 pages. Let's add a quick title page. I'm just being silly here, really, but just again to show you how quick you can do these things. Instead of blank page before page 1, then using the text tools, I'll create a text frame. I will go in here. I will say let's include the flow. Well, is that the flow title? I think it probably is the flow title. There we go. No, it's actually the project title. I didn't check to make sure. So let's have the project title. Let's have the project composer. I should really make that in the title style. Maybe I want that to be italic, which I can do with Command I. And then when I come out, there we go. And then I could have another text frame up here that says, you know, vocal score, whatever. You know, so, and again, I'm not doing anything serious here, but you see how quickly you can now I've got an 8-page thing that's nicely ready to print as a booklet, and it's pretty much ready to go, you know, in just literally a few seconds. And we've still got our full score completely unencumbered by any of that nonsense I've just done. I haven't ended up messing up the beginning of this one while I'm putting in the title page or anything like that. So you see how quickly and how powerfully you can do those kinds of edits in Dorico. So print mode is for making your performing materials. And if you're printing rather than exporting PDFs, you can do things like go through the strings, and you can say, right, well, actually, I know that when I'm printing, I'm going to need 4 copies of each of those. I only need 1 copy for horn 1, of course, and 1 copy for horn 2, or maybe actually I know I've got a depth, so I'll create 2 copies of the horn part because I want to have a spare, whatever it might be. So all of that very, very easy to do. Inside the software, just like that. So I have finished my introduction. God, that's ridiculous, isn't it? I do apologize. This man can talk, and he can talk. But there were a couple of things that we were going to talk about specifically to do with preparing performing materials, if that's okay. So I'd like to talk to you about condensing, about divisi, and about part layout. And about cues as well, if that's okay. If that sounds all right, I'll move on to great. So Dave's giving me the thumbs up, so I'm going to take that as red rag to a bull. I'm going to close these projects down, and I'm going to open up the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, which is in here. And hopefully this will open up okay. So this is a pretty large scale work, of course, hundreds and hundreds of bars. And I do believe, let me just check that I don't already have any cues. I can't remember what exact state this is in. So I'm just going to filter all the cues and delete them. There aren't any. Good. Okay, so let's look at cues first, because I think cues are one of Dorico's coolest features. Make this window a bit bigger. Just drag it out a bit. So you see here, here is the Concerto for Orchestra. I'm not going to do condensing yet. I'm going to make you wait for condensing, but we will come to that shortly. And if we go right the way back to the beginning of the first movement, now, obviously, in a huge work like this, one of the things that you really want to make sure that the performers know is when they're supposed to come in. So Dorico has really, really nice features for cueing. And we're going to start in the cues panel. Now, this feature here on the right-hand side allows Dorico to tell you a good place for each player to have a cue. So you can choose the amount of time. So you can decide on the attention span of your performers. By default, it says 30 seconds. Whether or not rehearsal marks should, because rehearsal marks themselves can sort of be cues, can't they? If you've got a rehearsal mark at, say, at bar 12, you can say, well, I don't really need another cue before that, because if they'll see that in their part, and that kind of gives them an idea for where they're going. So we're going to say consider rehearsal marks. We haven't got any cues already, so I'm just going to go update, and Dorico is then going to think, and interestingly has not produced any cue suggestions at all. Is that right? Does nobody rest for 30 seconds? That can't be right. Surely somebody is resting for 30 seconds. What is going on here?
Out.
Beg your pardon?
Is it because you filtered them out?
No, I deleted them deliberately so that I could create as. Oh, I see. Must be. There must be. There are so many rehearsal marks. Yeah. Okay. So there are so many rehearsal marks that if I consider rehearsal marks, nobody's ever resting for more than 15 seconds. So maybe I should have deleted my rehearsal marks as well. So if I now look. So now we've got this huge long list of cue suggestions, okay, in each instrument. And so the first one is flute 1, bar 60, and the flute have been resting for 75 seconds. So that's based on knowing what tempo is written in the music. And so now we get a little red highlight, and it says you probably want to think about what, giving the flute a clue as to what's going on. And then it also then tells you what are the other instruments that are playing at that point. So the clarinets are playing, the bassoons are playing, and the strings are playing. So you can then have a look down there and decide what looks like the most obvious thing to cue them. Well, I think let's just put on the little bar numbers thing for page view so we can see which instrument we're dealing with. So that's bassoon, that's tiny, but that's bassoon 1. So I'm going to cue bassoon 1, which is nice and prominent because the bassoon hasn't been playing otherwise. And I'm going to select those bars there, and I'm going to go Shift U, which is the shortcut for cues. And then I'm going to say bassoon 1. And I do that, and we don't see anything in the score by default. We'll see signposts, okay? But if I now show you the part, so if I press W, which goes to the flute 1 part, then you'll see there's the cue. Okay, these parts look a bit wacky actually, because they're using a really, really big stave size. Let's just go down to a slightly saner stave size. So now, before, hang on a second, which bar were we at? 75, right? Oh, am I in a movement other than the one I thought I was in? I thought I was in the first movement. Was I not? I wasn't. I was in the second movement. So here's the second movement. So here's all the multi-rests at the beginning of the flute part, and then there's our bassoon cue. And look how nice it looks. We've got our bar rests that help the flute player know these notes aren't for him or her. We've got the normal flute's clef, at the beginning of the system. No weird, confusing clef where suddenly that system starts with a bass clef. Then we've got the bass clef, and then we can see the bassoon is written like that. Now, maybe you think, well, hang on a second, my flute player doesn't know how to read bass clef. I think that's very insulting to flute players, but let's assume it was true for a minute. So we can say that we want to use the flute's normal clef. But of course, if we use the flute's normal clef, then that's now crazy low. So instead, what we can do is we can shift it into, whichever pitch feels like best. So we're saying that's the bassoon and it is now playing an octave lower than written, or that's the bassoon and it's playing 2 octaves lower than written. Just depending on whichever way around you think it's going to make most sense for the player to see it. But by default, Dorico will give you the clef of the source instrument in the cue. And as always, of course, there are choices in engraving options for what to do with clefs, whether to use the clef definition of the destination instrument or the source instrument, and so on. Now, what's really neat about this is that music, I can't even select it in here. Okay, that music doesn't exist really in the flute part. It's shown in the flute part, but it isn't really in the flute part. So if I now change this to have a vertical split, and then in this tab, I show you the score. Which will just take a moment because it's quite a big score. And so here, for example, is the bassoon material. So here's our bassoon material here. And if I now select that 2 bars of bassoon music and I transpose it up a step, you'll see that it changes the cue. And what's really neat is that I've also made exactly that same cue in the other flute part, which maybe I'll look at over here. So if we look at flute 2 and we go to the beginning of the second movement, again, it's using slightly dodgy staff size here. But again, that same material is there in the cue in the flute 2 part. So that means that I can cue whenever. So normally when you're producing your performing materials, you probably don't, in other programs, any cue that you make is going to be divorced from its original material. So in Sibelius, if you use paste as cue, then you're basically copying and pasting that music into editable music that really does then exist in the bassoon, in the flute part. And if I change the bassoon part, that cue isn't going to be updated. But in Dorico, that music isn't really there. So also, I can't accidentally edit the bassoon music in the flute part to make it out of step with what they're actually going to hear when the rehearsal starts. And likewise, I don't have to worry about only putting it in at the very, very end of the process, because I can carry on editing that bassoon music. Now, admittedly, it might be that I decide to change the orchestration completely and delete the music from the bassoons at that point, and then that cue would end up being empty. And right now, Dorico doesn't cleverly warn you that you've ended up with an empty cue, but that is something that we're planning to add in a future version, so that if you add a cue and then later on it turns out the instrument that you cued has no longer got any music, it can then warn you, hang on a second, that used to be a bassoon cue, but the bassoon doesn't have any music there now. And then you'll know that you should go in and either delete that cue or change it to be something else. And of course, an empty cue doesn't appear. It's just that you've lost the cue that you wanted to show. Yes, I'll be quiet so that David can ask his question.
Yes, thank you. I recently got into a situation where I wanted to do a cue in a chamber music piece using the piano to show the I think the violinist something. But the piano is funny as a cue because it's 2 staffs, and I think a cue can only be 1 staff. So I thought, okay, I'd use the top staff, but the trouble was at that moment, there was a 2-voice thing going on. There were actually playing inside the piano with 1 hand and on the keyboard with the other. So these had to be 2 different voices with 2 different stem directions. And what the composer didn't like was that there was appearing a quarter rest, which is necessary in the piano part, but for the cue, that didn't have to be seen. And I couldn't seem to not show that rest in the cue.
So yes, obviously I don't know the precise details of the situation you're talking about, David, but I think that, so that there are a couple of things that you can do. So for example, if we look at the bassoon part here, I mean, this is a bad example, right? So don't do what I'm about to do because I don't really think this is right. But I can, for example, move that cue like well, I suppose in this case we're still going to see that 16th rest there. But you could, for example, say don't pad with rests, right? So you can say hide rests around cue. This is terrible. Don't do what I'm doing here, right?
Right.
But get the general idea. So you
Right.
could
This
could
is not the sort of thing I'm talking about anyway. Although I
okay,
have used that, and that can occasionally be brilliant, but especially like let's say your cue begins toward the end of the bar, then that can make perfect sense what you just did. But no, what I mean is
you want to exclude one
it
voice.
started right. It started right from the beginning of the bar, and there was a note in the top voice. There was not a note, and there was a rest in the bottom voice, and that rest seemed to be something I could not hide in the cue.
That is correct. You
That
cannot
is correct. Okay.
rests in cues. I do not think. I think if I select that rest and do what can I do? Can I do this? I don't think I can do this really. No, I cannot. I was going to say that if I could say no, I can't do it. So you'd have to do the only thing you could do, which would be, can I do this? I'm not sure I can. Yeah, but what I can't do, I don't think, is yeah, so I can do that,
Oh,
which
that's
is
okay. Custom scale to 1, so it's so infinitesimally small that it's not seen.
yeah. So you can do that. And the other thing I was going to say is that in that kind of situation where maybe you actually want to show, I mean, obviously you're not, if you're queuing a whole piano onto a single instrument, then one of the big challenges you've got is how the heck do I, maybe if the register is nice and far apart, maybe you could have something with an octave line above the stave and maybe something with another octave line below the stave. But you can actually cue both piano A, as in the left-hand stave, the right-hand stave, and piano B, the left-hand stave, at the same time. You can have two cues at the same time, one up stem, which can be the right hand stave, and one down stem, which can be the lower stave, and they can actually then be shown on the same staff. So let's say that, for example, maybe it's gesturally important rather than, so they need to know when it goes bing, bang, bong, bing, rather than actually needing to read the notes, then it might be sufficient to say, okay, well, look, here's the rhythm one octave higher, here's the other rhythm one octave lower. That's still enough to orientate the player even if they are sort of reading weird octaves. So that's the other thing you can do is you can have
Right.
two cues simultaneously, A on top, B down below, and then octave shift them so that they don't kind of interact in the middle of the stave too much. And then, right, well, that's piano right hand, 8VA above or whatever, so that's another option.
The neat thing with cues too, which is brilliant, is I think if you don't care about the notes and this really is gesture or rhythm, you can show as slashes.
Indeed, you can. So you can show a rhythmic cue, which I'm just struggling to find the button.
Wasn't
There
that
it is.
for the bassoon thing, but yeah.
And then you can do that. Yeah. So of course, what's really fun as well is that you can then say, let's say that it's the rite of spring, and it's like it's the whole of the string section going jump, 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 jump. Then you can just write strings and get the rhythm. And so there's really a lot of flexibility. Now, if you really, really, really want to get super, super fancy and you do something that's where you want to show, let's say you want to show, I don't know, a combined cue for several woodwind instruments, like let's say the pitches are important and it's also you want to see flutes and oboes together or something like that. There you need to cheat a bit because what you can also do is you can create in your score a kind of scratch instrument for cues, and then you can manually create that chordal material that you want to see on your scratch instrument. And when you cue it in, it comes up saying, oh, I'm on scratch or whatever, but you've got the right pitch material. But then you can just change the label to say, woodwind or flute plus oboe, or whatever it is you want it to be. And again, if you just want to put flute and oboe together, stems up, stems down, you can just do that normally. But if for some reason you want to show, let's say a chorus of flute, oboe, and bassoon, and you want them to be chordally shown on one stem, for that you would need to play a little trick on Dorico to get it to do that. So you can't do that using the native functionality. But comparing that to the sort of the extremely manual workflow in every other program, it's massively easier that way. And the nice thing again about even doing it that way, where you've got your cheating and you've got a single stave with your chord on it, if you then want to show that cue in several instruments, again, you're still referring to one source material. So then if that cue needs to change, okay, yes, you need to remember, oh no, the voicing in the oboe has changed, so I need to go in and change the middle note of that chord in my scratch thing. But when you do that, it's then updated everywhere. So it's still a considerably easier and quicker than doing it in any other way. So the whole idea behind Dorico's cues feature is that it makes it cheap in terms of labor and easy enough that you should always add cues. If you're working with any piece of any kind of complexity for multiple players, hopefully the fact that Dorico can suggest to you places where players have been resting long enough that a cue might be helpful, and then the only thing it can't do for you basically is identify what should be cued. Maybe in future we'll be able to figure out what some kind of algorithm that could then determine what might make a good cue, like what's the part with the most rhythmic interest, or what's the part that might cut through because of the loudest, or what's the highest thing, or what seems like it's got a melody, or whatever it might be. Maybe that's something we can do in future. But for the time being, as I say, the idea is that obviously performers love it when you give them cues. They really, really find them invaluable. But in other notation programs, there's quite a lot of labor involved, a lot of decision making, and a lot of manual work. And you probably don't want to do it until you're pretty close to being finished with the piece, because the risk of having to then go back and fix all the cues is too high. Dorico eliminates like 90% of that work. And so that is a really, really important feature in the program. And again, no other software has that feature. And hopefully that means that the parts that you produce with Dorico are going to be that much better, that much more communicative of your intention, that much easier in rehearsal because people are going to know what's going on better. And as I say, it becomes second nature after a while that you can just create cues whenever you like. And in fact, even if while you're writing, well, of course, this is kind of dovetailing from that other part, and it would definitely be good for them to know how that melody is going to sort of feed into their part. You can do it right then and there. The very moment you write that dovetailed melody, you can add the cue and know that it will always be updated as you work. Let's look at condensing, which is another very, very important feature. So if I get rid of the split, get rid of the flute part for now. So if we go right back to the beginning of the whole piece, I want to be in the page view actually. So, gosh, it's massive, massive work. I should have chosen something not quite so huge as the Concerto for Orchestra. It was silly to choose such a big piece. So you can see here that we've got 3 oboes, 2 clarinets, 3 bassoons, 4 horns, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so obviously what our goal is to create really, really great performing material, so parts that are super, super clear, and we'll look at the parts in a minute, but also a conductor's score that's as clear as possible as well. And no conductor wants to look at a zillion staves. They just don't want to see it. Okay, so whenever possible, you want a condensed conductor's score. So that means where music for individual players is shown on a smaller number of staves, grouped by instrument, so that the conductor can see at a glance what's going on. Yes, you want it to be able to kind of split out if there's sort of lots of complex stuff going on, but certainly when people are resting, you do not need to see 4 staves for the horns when they're resting. You do not need to see it. So Dorico contains this pretty magical feature called condensing, which will do all of that in one click. And here is that click. You go to the edit menu, you choose condensing, then you wait. Admittedly, this will take a while because this is a massive, massive file. So let me see how long this is actually going to take. Maybe I'll go down to just one flow. Let's see how bad it is. This is, I don't know how many, I think it's about 3,500 bars, the Concerto for Orchestra. So it is a very, very big very, very big score. So now, if we look at this first system, you'll see that we got flutes 1 and 2 on one stave, flute 3, oboes shown on one stave, clarinets on one stave, bassoons on one stave, horns on 2 staves because they're interlocking 1, 3, 2, 4, trumpets on one stave, etc., etc., etc. Now, that also then means if we look at engrave mode, we can now see that this first page is only 78% full. And we can also increase the staff size, hopefully quite considerably, maybe not to 6mm, but let's go to 5.5 and see how horrible that is. Again, this will take a while because it's now got to relay out the entire condensed score. And again, yes, it takes a while. It'd be nice if it was quicker, but compared to the labor involved in manually creating a condensed score for 3,500 bars, waiting 10 seconds is not really a massive problem. Okay, so now we're 114% full. That's a bit over full, but that's probably in practice actually fine. And so the difference is now massive, right? Because we've made the staves 50% bigger, 50% bigger. Which is going to be much, much more legible for the conductor to read. And it's also much, much clearer what's going on. So as we go through, if we look here at the flute part, so we've got flute 1, it's labeled flute 1, pianissimo. Now we've got flutes 1 and 2, and it's all nicely worked out. We've now got just flute 1 playing. There's a rest to show us that flute 2 is still active there. We keep on going. That's still flute 1. Blah, 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 blah. On we go, on we go, on we go. Then we can see here the horns come in. There's horn 1 playing. We get horns 2 and 4 are just sort of resting. And we've got the horn 3 rest below the stave. We've got altered unisons here in the trumpet part. So we've got 3-note chords. We've got a B flat, a D natural, and a D sharp. So those things are showing together. This is all consolidated into a single voice because the rhythms match. And all of this, now we split onto 2 staves because there will be a pitch cross on here somewhere. Oh, well, in fact, look, there's 2 notes in trumpet 3, which is nonsense. That's a mistake in my rendition of the score. That's obviously nonsense. But do you see how it basically goes phrase by phrase and it works out how best to dispose the music between staves and voices, and it does this automatically without you needing to lift a finger.
Daniel,
yes,
for trumpet, just earlier where you had that split of 2 notes, yeah, there you go, that kind of Y split stem. Now a conductor might not be certain which of the trumpets has which of those notes. So what if you wanted on the page before that to split 1 and 2 from one another yourself?
Absolutely, yes, you can certainly do that. So let's say, for example, that you want to show, as you say, 1 and 2 on one stave and in 2 voices as well, so that you can see that they are that you know exactly whose note is whose, and then 3 can then go on to their own staff. So we could do that by going into engrave mode, which we're already in. We select something here. And then you go engrave, condensing change. Okay, and then we're working on the trumpet group. And in fact, interesting. Why are we not seeing that then? If I already have oh, look, I've already got condensing change, possibly of exactly that thing. I do. Because there's a system break. Right, of course. So now the thing is, right, so even if you have a condensing change and you say to Dorico, it's because I've changed the staff size, that's upset it. Yeah, I obviously chose a different staff size than the last time I demonstrated this file, so I apologize for that. So what's going to be the easiest way to put a system break in? Let's do it by, this is ugly, but let's do it this way.
This is ugly, but let's do it this way.
Sorry, Thomas, so I think you're unmuted all of a sudden. I'm coming through on your microphone. So we now have, so here we go. Can somebody mute Thomas for us? So yeah, let me just delete that condensing change and show you how you would have set that up from scratch, because that is exactly the result that we wanted, but let's show you how to get there. So right here, you choose, so now we've got trumpets on one stave, okay? You go engrave, condensing change, you choose your trumpet group, you say, yes, I'm only interested in the trumpets here, and I now want to decide the condensing for myself. So I want to drag trumpet 1 over there, I want to drag trumpet 2 over there, and then I want to add a stave, and stave 3 gets stave 2, sorry, gets trumpet 3. And when I press OK, you'll then see, after it has a bit of thinking time, now we get trumpet 1 stems up, trumpet 2 stems down, and trumpet 3 on the stave below. And it will stay that way until we tell it otherwise. So let's say we want Dorico to be able to go back to its own devices here. So again, we go engrave, condensing change, we choose trumpets again, and then we say reset. Now this is pretty advanced condensing stuff. You can generally let Dorico kind of do its own thing for the most part. And again, it's worth saying that because we're in the middle of a system here, Dorico doesn't really have a great deal of freedom about how it's going to change things, because you don't want suddenly trumpet 3 to be up on trumpet 1's stave halfway through a system. There are some scores where that is done. I've seen some very, very, very tightly condensed scores where, you know, you might have 2 staves for the horns, and at the first half of the system it's, you know, 1 3 2 4, and then later on it's 1 2 3 4, and Dorico can't do that. I'll be upfront about it, but that is something you do occasionally see, but generally less.
Yeah, Daniel, just a quick note to power users. When I do this, I've found, especially with a complex or large score, what I'll do is, I know I want to make a change here, and I know I want it to go back over here. I'll do the second condensing change first. So put that one in with reset. This way, when you put in the earlier one with the change, it's not calculating it out for the entire piece. And then when you do reset, calculating that out for the entire piece. Just to go on.
I think that also has one other benefit as well, which is that it guarantees, you know, if you already know that's what you want to do, it also guarantees that you don't then like find, oh, hang on a second, that doesn't look the way I expect it to later on. So I think that's great advice. I do agree. That is really, really good advice. So the neat thing about condensing is that, again, all of this is happening in the score. You've got a certain amount of control in engrave mode. You know, obviously you can still tweak things graphically in engrave mode. So even though that dynamic is a condensed one, you can drag all these things around. Everything is still editable in exactly the same way as if it was uncondensed. But again, you can't change the music. So I can select the note in engrave mode, but if I'm in write mode, I actually can't select the note. So in condensed music, I can't edit it in page view. If I want to edit it while condensing is on, I can go to galley view and then I can edit it. But the really, really neat thing about this is that none of this impacts the parts at all. So here we are at, you know, if I go into engrave mode, and I'll just try selecting something so that we'll try and get into the right part. So if I now switch to the flute, I suppose that's a flute 2 note. So if I go to flute 2, I didn't bring it in. Didn't bring it into view. Dagnabbit, what bar were we at? Well, anyway, it actually doesn't matter what bar we're at. The point is, and again, I apologize, I messed around with this file the last time I used it, and I've left it in a right old state. But if we have a more sensible stave size, there we go. You can see that none of that condensing business that we're dealing with in the full score affects the part layouts at all. So you don't have to, you know, it's very, very easy to have exactly what you expect to see in the score and exactly what you expect to see in the part. And you should very, very rarely ever need to do a separate score for parts and separate score for score, as it were, which is very common in the other programs. There will be situations where you want something so specific that Dorico's sort of set of tools that it provides for what to do won't give you exactly the result that you want, but they will be few and far between. I would just like to step away from the computer just for one moment, because I could do with a comfort break, if that's okay. So I'm just going to take 2 minutes and then I'll be right back with you, if that's okay. So I'm just going to mute myself for a moment and I'll be right back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody
You know,
else
some
want to
others
go to
here are
audio
taking
break?
you up on that. Good point.
If you have questions,
Greg, I think I can answer Greg's. But Greg, are you there? Would you unmute Greg Steinke? Steinke? I'm not sure how to say your name, Greg. Maybe he went for a comfort break.
I just asked him to unmute.
But you can do it. No? I'm not going to get into his question if he's not there.
Greg, can you unmute?
Yeah,
this?
yeah, I'm still here. Sorry, I had to.
There you are, Greg. You know, while Daniel's taking his comfort break, I think I can just answer your question, because even right now on the screen that Daniel left up, if you look in the lower left corner, you will see right there it says concert pitched, transposed pitch. So right now this flute part, and I don't have access to his screen, so I can't move things around. But right now, his flute part, since it's concert, you don't see a change. But if he had left up clarinet, you would be seeing it in transposition. That switch down there is how you show them. And as far as rules for printing in concert or printing in transpose, let's say that'll come up more often with the score. That I think is in layout options.
The program
Okay,
warn you.
Yeah.
If you try to print in concert pitch.
Yeah, the program will warn you, but typically I think that's the kind of thing. There are switches in layout mode where, like, if for some bizarre reason you wanted the B flat concert part, the B flat part of the clarinet to be in C for some reason, shown in C, you could even do a crazy thing like that in layout mode. So yes, that's actually very simple. We don't need to.
okay. So you can enter your score all in C if you want,
Absolutely, yeah.
and then parts can be switched as needed. Yeah.
Exactly. And even the score can be shown in transposition if you wanted. I was
Okay.
just doing that as a time saver, Daniel, while you were away.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Much appreciated. Thank you so much.
You got it. You got it.
Yes, indeed. In fact, by default, Dorico will show all the parts in transposed pitch. And I think it shows, depending on which template you use, the score can either be in concert or in transposed pitch, but absolutely, yes. Yeah, and you can work either way. And in fact, you can even do, if you're copying out an existing part, you can even input it, reading the transposed pitch, but putting in the concert pitches and hearing, every combination you might need to work with in terms of concert and transposed pitch is accommodated fairly easily. So if it's okay, I would like to talk about string parts a little bit, because I think they do pose particular challenges. And again, this piece might be a bit bonkers, but we can see some stuff going on here that will give us some ideas. Yeah, and we've got slightly too much music on these pages here as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of these issues. So Divisi was the thing I wanted to start with. So as I said, very, very long time ago now, and thank you very much for bearing with me for all this time, section players can only hold a single instrument. So a violin section will only have violins in it, but they can divide. And here in whichever the heck movement we're in, is this the second? No, this is the first movement. So 450 bars into the first movement, the violins divide, and you can see here how hopefully you can see this is unit. So we're unison here, consort, beep, 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 right? And then here at 456, we're now divided. And can you see this little pink signpost? That is actually the point at which, so you know how we created our little signpost for condensing change. We wanted to say how trumpet 1 and 2 should go on one stave and trumpet 3 on the other. Well, this Divisi signpost is how we tell Dorico how we want the violin parts to be split. So you can see here that it's just divided in two. And what happens then is that as we get to bar 437 and we still are in one part, Dorico is automatically showing the music on both staves. So by the time we get to bar 456, we need two staves, but we don't at bar 437. So if I, for example, create a system break here, then you'll see that we now get just one stave on this system, and then the divisi starts here. And it might be that we also want to show, I think actually the divisi labels must be turned off. Again, I can't quite remember what I've done with this file, which is silly. I'm sorry I didn't spend more time checking. I thought I'd put it back to how I had it before, but I didn't. So we just want to show, yes. So for example, show the section name on the first system. So now when we get to the point where we divide, now we get 1, 2, for example. As it happens, this particular example, you probably don't want to see this, because in fact what Bartok specifies is that it's actually 4 soloists rather than like half the desks splitting either way. But do you see the general idea that in the divisi thingy here, oh sorry, which of course I have to be in write mode to edit, I can actually change this so that I could put here, inside, outside, whatever, whatever instructions I want, and then that will be the label that appears there. And you can specify, however many groups you want. You can have a soloist and then Liautri, or you can have 4 soloists and then, everybody else, or 4 separate groups, or 12 separate groups, or 16 separate groups, or whatever it is. And what happens?
Question here.
Yeah.
Roger, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood.
Yeah, this being concerto for orchestra, I've never seen an unreduced version of the score. Actually, the two flutes were originally online in the copy score I have. But anyway, what you're showing now with the VZs, is this on as derived from the full score, or is derived from the condensed score?
Great question. So divisi can also be, so it is derived from the full score, to answer the question directly. And the way that it works is that when you create divisi in your string instruments, they by default will show 1 stave for each division that you create. So if you have a soloist, well, in fact, soloists will always show on their own stave, but let's say you split your violin into 3 sections, and none of them are soloists, it's just 3 sections. And so violin 1 is now trucking along with A, B, and C. By default, they will show as 3 staves, A, B, and C, or 1, 2, and 3. In the score, you can then tell Dorico, well, actually, if I can condense those onto a single stave, then still do that. So in layout options, when you're dealing with condensing, you can choose whether section players should be condensed at all. So don't condense them at all. So that means that, because for example, what you don't want is violin 1 and violin 2 to be condensed onto a single stave. You don't want that. But what you might want is for divisi within violin 1 to be condensed. So instead of then showing 3 staves for violin 1, you see 1 stave for violin 1, but then in the violin 1 part, you'd still see 3 staves. So you can still have this distinction between what you see in the score and what you see in the part. The reason we have this option, condense, divisi, and adjacent players, is that, for example, in concert band music or wind band music, you often do have clarinets 1 and clarinets 2, which is a group of clarinet players, for example, and they might well want to be condensed together in the score. Even though they're not divisi, you might want to have clarinet 1 and clarinet 2, which is actually a bunch of clarinets still shown on a single stave, in the same way that solo clarinet 1 and clarinet 2 would be shown. So you can have condensed divisi on, and that can be set in the part as well if you want. So if you wanted to, you could even have a part for the violins that, where possible, shows a single stave, or you could decide to always show separate staves. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, good.
We're getting a yes, and it's possibly worth reminding everybody, because we're using the terms condense and divisi. Yeah, divisi is just going to refer to section players, which is basically strings, and condensing is the individual players. So you might have 4 horns, but each horn is its own instrument. You wouldn't make one instrument and call it horn 1 and 3. You've got a player playing horn 1, a player playing horn 3, and you can decide to show them on the same staff or break them up.
Which is my recollection of what the original concerto for orchestra score actually does.
Yeah, 1, 3, 2, 4, right.
And
that's all very
especially in
duplicated.
flutes, right at the beginning. you have the two flutes doing the contrary motion on a single.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
And-
But critically, when you're if you were inputting the concerto for orchestra from scratch, you wouldn't create one stave and then write flute one in voice up and flute two in voice down. You would not do that.
What if
You
you're
flute
stupid?
one player, and flute two player, and you write the music on the flute one stave and the music on the flute two stave, and then you enable condensing, and Dorico does that bit for you. And the reason that it works that way is that then effectively you can think of it as being part first. You're always thinking about what is the individual player going to see, and then you worry about what the conductor is going to see later. And you may have a very clear idea right from the beginning about what you want the conductor to see, and that is fine. But in order to make sure that the parts are always going to be correct, because flute one never wants to see any of flute two's music and vice versa. Very occasionally in movie music, you might want to show music for multiple players. Sometimes violin one and violin two will be written in the same part, for example. And of course, percussion scores are a special case. But certainly for flutes, you do not want flute two's music in flute one's part unless it's a cue. So you start by creating a flute one player and a flute two player, and you write that music on each player, and then you enable condensing, and then Dorico knows to put that music onto a single stave. That is really, really, really important. And again, completely the opposite way around from all the other programs, where if you want to see that in the score, you've got to write it that way in the score. And in Sibelius, you can now use their new so-called decondensing feature, which I find very, very funny, because Sibelius doesn't have a condensing feature, but they have to define that feature as being the absence of the condensing feature. So they call it decondensing, which I find really, really hilarious. But it means that, and you can only do that for two players, whereas with Dorico, you can actually have as many as 16 players condensed onto a single stave if you really need to. And again, in Finale, you can do the thing where you can, remove in the linked part. As long as you've got very, very careful use of voices, you can do it. But Dorico doesn't put any restrictions like that on you. You simply write the music the way that it needs to be seen by the player, and then it takes care of all the condensing for you. And I know that if you're used to another program, that can be a big shift. And Dorico does, by the way, provide tools that make it easier. So let's say, for example, that you want to write your four horns and you want to write them all at once. You've got this kind of chordal voicing in mind. You can actually, when you're inputting the notes in the first place, you can extend the caret, which was that orange line that we used that show where you're going to put the notes in. You extend the caret across all four horn parts, play a four-note chord in your MIDI keyboard, and Dorico is going to input those four notes on each of those horn staves. And so you could even have galley view open in one view and your condensed score open in another view, inputting galley view across four staves, and see them appear as four condensed chords, four-note condensed chords in the score at the same time as you're inputting them. But the critical thing is, put the music in for each player. Dorico can figure out what the score needs to look like. You can influence, of course, in every possible way how the score eventually looks, if that's very important to you, which of course it should be. But start from the parts. Start from the parts. That is the golden rule.
Daniel, now when I initially set this up, I unfortunately did not hit you up to stay with us until 7. There's so much to cover, and thank you. Would you say there are a couple of things, one or two things you feel it's very important to get to before we run out of time?
Yes, I think there are a couple of things. So let me just very, very quickly just show you two more things to do with part layout, because I just think that, again, there's a couple of things that I would just like to give you hints on, really, for your own work. This is a really, really good example, this part, because it looks pretty bad by Dorico's standards. So if let me just check, I haven't got signposts hidden. So this is a default part. The only thing we've influenced manually is putting that system break in there so that the divisi starts there rather than there. But otherwise, this is a default looking part, and it's not bad, but it's not great. And in particular, the early pages have a couple of bad problems. So let's look at page 3 here, for example. So you can see that on page 3, we've got some really, really uneven spacing. And if we go to engrave mode, we can see that this page is actually over full. Now, what's happened here is that Dorico has to guess. The sort of the nature of figuring out what music goes on what page is a circular problem. Dorico has to first work out how wide the music is before it knows what bars can go on each system. Then it has to work out how the systems tessellate together so it can work out how many staves are going to fit on the, what the distance between staves in the system will be, and then how many systems will fit on the page. But of course, it turns out that the interaction of one system to the system below is also dependent on how far apart they are. It matters, for example, whether or not this slur and these low notes happen to coincide with this rehearsal mark here above the stave. And so Dorico can't work this all out in full generality before it's come up with its answer. Dorico, frankly, is slow enough. It would be even slower if it had to go round and round and round the loop every time to work out what it wants to do. So in tricky cases, and this page here is another great example, where you've got tempo changes, rehearsal marks, you've got things below the stave, you've got lots of stuff going on. And basically, Dorico is not making a perfect decision so what do you do about it? So you might think, well, I'm going to have to even up those staves. And that might be the right thing to do, but it probably isn't. So I just want to give you a couple of strategies for how to solve these problems. So the first and simplest thing to do is, if Dorico's made a bad mistake and it's got one system too many on a part, the first thing to try is just try moving one system to the next page. So select something at the beginning of the bar where you want to be the first bar of the next page and do Shift F for frame break. Immediately, that's so much better on that page, so much better. It's still a little uneven because of this situation here. And in fact, I think probably we can change something in the engraving options dialog that would make that a little bit better. Although I can never remember whether it's on the rehearsal marks page or the tempo page. It's on the tempo page. See, it's the one where we have the above here we are. Like I said, it already thinks it is positioned to the right. Okay, so in theory, Dorico is doing the right thing here, which is that it should know that it can put the 313 mark here and then move the tempo primo a little bit to the right rather than having the rehearsal mark bunch up. But for whatever the specific reason is, it's not doing it in that particular situation. So we could fix that, but I won't worry about that for right now. But that generally would be one way to avoid it. So instead, let's worry about how do we fix this particular case. So what I would say in general is that this string parts are special because they often have divisi and lots of stuff. For wind parts, one thing that you might consider is in vertical spacing in layout options is to try turning this option off. Now, this seems like a bit of a radical thing to suggest. Turning off the automatically resolve collisions between adjacent staves and systems option. But all that really means is that Dorico won't then move the systems according to what's above and below them. Instead, you'll be basically getting them positioned according to the default gaps. So if I do that, we now get precisely evenly spaced staves. Okay, now here I've got a system break, which is why we then, a frame break, which is why we now don't get that. Now, as a starting point, depending on what you want to do, so again, how many systems have we got typically per page? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which is a good number. But let's say that we were happy with saying that we only want 9 on each page. So this would save us a huge amount of time, right? So if pages didn't cost money, we could say, let's have 9 systems per frame, and let's not worry about the first page either. We think we can always get 9 on there as well. Now it might, and we've got room at the bottom for copyright, which maybe we need, maybe we don't need, but let's leave it there for now. Now, on every page, all of the systems are their default height. Now, it's not going to work when you've got divisi, and that's why I say this is not a good thing for a string part. It's better, though, for a wind part where you don't typically need to worry about this kind of stuff. It's really bad, as you can see here. Fixing 9 systems per frame when you've got divisi is a very bad idea indeed. But it's a pretty good idea in a wind part. Nevertheless, even if you let Dorico just do the default spacing, even with Divisi, you're going to get a much more balanced page. So before you start going in, and again, this is what I was saying earlier on, I just want to reiterate it one more time. Don't immediately go in and start dragging things around in engrave mode. Don't do it. Instead, take a minute to have a more holistic view of what you're looking at. For example, here, it's a bit crap. If you'll pardon my French, I apologize for swearing. It's a bit rubbish that you've now got the second movement starting on an otherwise empty page. Okay, we can probably find a way of fixing that orphan earlier on. But another option is to say, well, actually, I don't mind if flows start on the same page as a previous flow ends. So now, when we get to the end of the first movement, the second movement can quite happily, gosh, hang on, I've lost it. Where were we? Where's movement 2? Oh, hang on a second, I've got flow headings turned off as well. Which won't help. Now we can't see where the flows are. So now I'm allowed to start here on this second thing. Now I'm going to want to change the margins around that flow heading because that looks again really bad because we've got the rehearsal marks on top of the flow heading. But immediately, without doing anything, now there's the beginning of the third movement. And again, I think I probably really do want a margin below the flow heading that's a bit bigger. Let's double it in size so that we've got a bit more room there. 24 millimeters is still only just over an inch. And now it's a bit clearer, and it'll be a bit clearer where the second movement starts as well, although we've got no heading above. So let's give it a bit of padding above. And this is all just making global changes. I'm just eyeballing it for the time being. So before I get too trigger happy with dragging things around, it's worth experimenting, because if you can make global changes that are going to make big improvements to how the part looks, that's going to save you so much time compared to getting in there and dragging things around manually. Again, I made a choice earlier on where on the players page I said that for Divisi, sorry, on the Staves and Systems page, I should show section names for our Divisi changes. And in fact, wherever the Divisi is here, this is going to have some options set to say, yes, show the markings. No, follow the options for all of that stuff. Then those can go away, and you can decide whether or not they should show case by case. But now the only thing I really need to worry about is, from moment to moment, do I have collisions that are really, really bad? Yeah, I've got some stuff here that isn't really very good. So let's just cheat and put a frame break in here. Then we can cheat further and move that down there. And maybe for that page, that's the only edit I need to do. Maybe I want to move that one as well. But do you see what I mean? And then that way, I'm not spending loads of time dragging staves around, which is one of the hardest things to get right. Once you start dragging staves around because you're feeling like the page has lost its balance, it's really, really hard to get that balance back. So try to avoid doing that, is my sort of advice, really, when it comes to part preparation stuff. And I've chosen a string part here, which is the most awkward case. But I would guess that if we were to look at, say, the bassoon part, that would already look pretty much, okay. Now, one thing that Dorico doesn't yet do, which I would really like it to do, and which a future version will do, is it doesn't help you with page turns. So you're going to want to again go through with a critical eye, putting in frame breaks on right-hand pages. Again, I think it's going to be better if we have a frame break there. That's the end of the movement. That's fine. That's actually all totally fine there. This is a left-hander, that's a right-hander. Let's see what happens if we do allow flows to start on the same page. So like this. So again, let's just review what we had. So that's a right-hander, and you can see by where the borders are, what's a left-hander, what's a right-hander. So that's fine, we end there. That's not very good, really. So in fact, it's going to be much better if we start, oops, what did I select there that sent things crazy? I've got something selected that's messing me up. What have I got selected? I've done something foolish somewhere. Can't work out why I'm springing back. Okay, well, anyway, you get the general idea. And again, very, very quick to do page turns just by eyeballing left-handers and right-handers and if you've got an obvious candidate for putting in rests, you can very quickly put them in by just shunting a system onto the next frame or next page. Again, as I say, in future, we hope that Dorico will do more of those things automatically. And also, if it can't find something good, put a little warning at the end of the right-hand page that says, "Oh, watch out," or say. One other thing you might want to do is you might find it's helpful to split the rest either side of the page turn and have 3 bars rest after the page turn. And we would like it if Dorico could say, "Oh, there's 3 bars rest after the page turn, so you don't need to hurry as well." Which other things that you'll see in really, really well produced and well prepared parts. We will have features for all of those things in future versions of Dorico, because it's all about trying to make the process of getting practical performing materials prepared as quickly and as well as possible. Oh, it's playing.
Daniel, I've got a oh, it was playing. I've got an applicable question. Kurt was asking, using condense in a score that has sections that wouldn't work, but others that would. This is something I've been curious about too. I mean, do you just have to go through this manually, or let's say a certain movement you want it, but others you don't? It's a layout option, so it's going to just either affect or not affect all of the movements, right?
Exactly correct. So the way that you would do it is,
whereas, by the way, notation options, you can just do that by movement.
Absolutely.
But
so for layout specific things, the way that we typically do it is that there's then a change object. So for condensing, there's a condensing change object. So what you would do is you would go to, if Dorico ever wakes up again, if I go to the beginning of the second movement, let's say in this movement, you don't want to create any condensing. So we would go here, we would go engrave, condensing change, and then you would go tick tack top tick tack like this. And you would say for each of those, no condensing. No
right.
condensing.
This brings me to a feature request. Given we're watching you go through all this, it would be great to be able to select a number of things on the left and affect them all in the same way, rather than stepping through it like that.
It would, although it did only take me 20 seconds. So
okay. It's more the carpal tunnel.
Yes, I mean, I agree with you, of course. That dialogue is tricky because the once, anything where you can make, so all of those things could already have conflicting settings by the time you make a multiple selection. So I'm not saying that we're lazy, because we're far from lazy, but it's quite difficult to code a dialogue that complicated and make sure that every combination of things that you could select would then still show you the right thing on the right hand side. Obviously, for the manual condensing, it wouldn't be able to show anything at all. But for the options on the right hand side, your flutes might say, "I'm allowed to amalgamate slurs," and the oboes might say that they're not. And so then when you select those two things, what do we show for the options on the right hand side? So I do agree with you. And for some dialogues like layout options, we do go to the really quite annoyingly extensive trouble of making that possible. But it is a lot of complexity, and it also is likely to, the danger of that is it can introduce bugs, which we also try to avoid if we possibly can. So yeah, that's why we don't do that. Good. So I think that's probably it for part prep and condensing and so on. Have we lost the folks in the room there? Have they gone? Or have they? I think we've lost them. So we might have to wait for them to come back. I think we have lost. I don't see David. I don't see Tim. So I think we've lost them temporarily. Okay, so I'm just going to refer to the notes that I made of the things that David sent me. Right, so we had some questions about percussion, and I would just like to dwell quickly on percussion. I don't know if it was somebody who was in the room who wanted to know about percussion, but I will just show you a little bit about how percussion works while we wait for the folks in the room to reappear, if they ever will. So if I just create a brand new score again, create a single player and create an empty kit. So percussion, you can have a single percussionist and they can hold multiple players, and those multiple players can either be in a kit or they can be held individually by the player. So in fact, I'll tell you what, let's start with the percussionist who doesn't have a kit. So we go in here and let's say we want to add, I'm very unimaginative always whenever I'm adding percussion instruments, so I apologize for my lack of imagination. We'll have clash cymbals, we'll have bass drum, and let's say we'll have snare drum as well. So now, as you can see, in fact, let's remove the other player just temporarily so we can see what we're doing. So if we now look at the percussion part, we might want to see effectively a percussion. So there's lots and lots of different ways of doing percussion stuff, of course, but let's assume that we want for our percussion part to see a percussion score, which means that we don't want any instrument changes. And we probably also want to see full and abbreviated instrument names so that we can see which stave is which. And we probably also want to change that rather than being that, but we'll call that percussion 1. And you might also then want to have a little thing here that shows you the instruments in there, and you can do that. There's a can't remember what token it is, but you can add a token there in the page layout thing that will then list triangle, clash cymbal, bass drum, snare drum, and so on like that. So now I've got my 4 instruments, and so I can now write my masterpiece of percussion, which I'm afraid I definitely am not qualified or equipped to do as a singer. I know nothing about percussion really, apart from do with my own body. So I can write my part like this, and that's fine. I can also have instead, if I, as I say, an instrument changes version. So if I go in here and I allow instrument changes, then I can have that, which is maybe not mega helpful in this case, because the changes are so close together, but you get the general idea. So now each instrument is announced and it's all written on one line. But I might also want to show that in a completely different way. So if I turn instrument changes off one more time, then I can also combine all of these instruments into a kit. And what do I get from combining them into a kit? Well, I get a couple of things. So they combine instruments into kit. So now I can now choose how the percussion should appear. And it can appear differently in each layout if I want it to. So for example, let's say that in the score, I want to show on a 5-line stave, and in the parts, I want to show on individual grid lines, but maybe not quite so shown as 4 individual instruments as I just had. So now, for example, look at the score, we see the same thing as we do in the part. Hang on, let me just show both of you at the same time. So there's the score and there's the part. So now if I'm looking at the score and I go into players, percussion, 5-line staff. So now you can see, and I'll just help you to see what's going on by creating a percussion legend as well. And that gives them to you in the order that they appear. Whereas in the part, I can now see them as a grid. And of course, if I really want to, in the part, I can still show them as a single line instruments as we originally had them. And I can still then see them as a 5-line stave in the score. So you can, again, it's a kind of condensing, if you like, for percussion, so that you can see the music shown in the part as a percussion score, but for the conductor, they can just see, you know, percussion 1 or whatever as a single 5-line stave, and then you can do either you can label each individual entry with percussion legends, or, you know, again, if you prefer, in the score you could show a grid so that each stave is labeled individually, or you could show. So do you see what I mean? You've got this flexibility. And what's quite fun is that if, for example, in the score, it's shown as a 5-line stave, and then in the kit, so if you watch what happens as I drag things around, if I put the triangle down here and then move the snare drum here, then when I press apply, this updates, the legend updates, and this updates as well. So I can dynamically reorder the instruments, and I don't need to worry about, again, going through and fixing up all the notation. Dorico already knows. You might also say, okay, so on the snare drum, there's lots of different techniques on the snare drum. So, for example, if we look in here, it's not super clear when it's black on grey, but you've got normal notes, rim shot, cross stick, and side stick as well. So, how would I input those? So, if I go into my kit, my snare drum's on the top line, and I can now input a note, and I can do it either with the MIDI keyboard, or if I want to do it with my computer keyboard, I press Y for the default pitch, and then I can go through the different notes with Shift Alt up and down arrow like this. Okay, I don't know whether you can hear, but it's also auditioning those notes as well. I don't know if it's coming through on Zoom, and it gives you the different techniques. And I can also, before I input the note, just use Alt up and down. So if I know I want to input a rim shot, I go Alt. So that's normal snare drum if it doesn't show anything. Sorry, let me zoom in a bit more so you can see that a bit bigger. That's normal snare drum, side stick, cross stick, rim shot. So I can put that in like this. And so you can easily have different playing techniques. And again, those should all play back. How do they play back? So they play back according to which drum map is loaded and which actual playback instrument you're using. And you can see what that is by going to play mode. So in play mode, when you have a percussion kit, each of the instruments in the kit gets its own entry. And by the way, also gets its own entry in a percussion editor here. So another thing that you can do is you can input music directly into the different playing techniques by inputting them into these little sub lanes in the percussion editor. But let's not worry about that for right now. So you can see here that the snare drum is playing back using the Iconica Sketch percussion map. And I can then actually click that and I can see what sounds, this is all a bit scary at first, I will grant you, but it does show you all of the sounds that are played back by the snare drum. What would be really good is if you could type snare or something in here, and then it could just show you the snare ones, because it only affects these lines from here to here. So you can see that in Iconica Sketch, actually, it doesn't have, for example, rim shot or cross stick. That's because those are more kit percussion things, but it does support roll and tremolo, which is of course the same sort of thing, and trill. So I can then, if I want to write a roll, I can take my normal note and I can either write a trill. So if I write a trill, that will then, again, I don't know if you're going to hear this, but that will play back a roll, or I can write tremolo. So again, Shift R, and then I can do 3-stroke tremolo, and that will play back a roll. I don't know if you can hear that. Or I could write, another. I could write, roll or something I wanted to on there, and that would trigger the right playback effect. And if I had an actual drum kit, so if I had a real drum kit to the score, like this, then a drum set, of course, by default comes up as a 5-line stave. And if we look at for the kit here, you'll see that it's got all of the normal instruments. And again, the snare has still got those techniques. But this time, when we go to play mode, if we look at the drum set, when I choose the snare drum, you can see that it's actually going to play back using this sort of general MIDI style kit rather than orchestral percussion kit. And in fact, it's even going to be played back by this Groove Agent plugin, which has snare there. There's the side stick, and there's I can't see where the other techniques are, but you can basically edit what these paths show. And so then if I write on my kit snare drum, that, and then I'll do side stick. Again, I don't know if you can hear this, cross stick, rim shot, and they all come out differently, because that is how Dorico knows the difference between an orchestral snare drum and a kit snare drum, if that makes sense. And so it loads different sounds based on whether you're putting it into the context of orchestral percussion or kit percussion, if that makes sense.
Just one quick question, Daniel.
Yeah, go for it.
So if aside from the simple drum kit, if different instruments are being played simultaneously, Dorico doesn't have a problem condensing them, into the single staff on the kit that you have on the left here, does it? I mean, it's
Yes, exactly. So if I was to give my drumstick player, I don't know, a glockenspiel as well, then I mean this is an unusual pairing. I think we can all agree, but nevertheless a possible one. So if we then add a couple more bars, then when we write some music on our glockenspiel, and when we go back to the drum set part, you can see there's the drum set and there's the glock. And again, if you prefer to see them not written out on a single stave like that, you can also do that. Although then you'd probably also want to change the settings for staff labels so that you can see that's the drum set, that's the glock part. You see what I mean? But yes,
Daniel,
yes.
what about a situation where you have four percussionists and at least two of them are playing pitched instruments like vibraphone and glockenspiel, or more exotic instruments where they need two staves to play those instruments?
Indeed, it can even do that. So if we add a nice big marimba, then okay, of course now the glockenspiel is crazy range wise compared to marimba, but if we go back to showing instrument changes, then at the point where it swaps onto marimba, you now get two staves and it's labeled and you get your clefs and everything else. So yeah, it can cope with all of that. Probably chances are you'll end up arranging it so that that happens at a system break. It's always a bit unnerving when you see it go into two staves in the middle of a system, but it's no problem. You can do that. And if you then want to, if it turns out that for one system he's playing very high on the marimba, doesn't need the bass clef, you can hide it on just that one stave and so on. So yeah, you've got lots and lots of power and flexibility with those kinds of layout problems as well.
Okay.
So yeah, I think that was what I wanted to show you to do with percussion. Then somebody had asked about about unmetered music, aleatoric music, and different meters on different staves. So I thought I would very quickly show you how to do that. Again, without being a particularly creative writer when it comes to that kind of stuff. If I just start with a brass quartet, that'll be fine. So let's say, for example, that we wanted, let's add, I don't know, an obligato instrument. Let's say we've got our regular brass quartet, and then we're going to have a solo violin who's playing with the quartet, and we're going to say that is a soloist, which will put them at I suppose actually in this particular case it'll put them at the bottom, because I could show you how to move that soloist so that it is automatically above by default, but I will gloss over that for now because that's not what I want to show you. And let's say that the violinist is going to be playing in open meter. So what we can do then is we can select something on the violin, we can go Shift X for open meter, and then we can do Alt Return, and that will then now show you that you've got and in fact we can even hide that little X so that we show nothing. Now we've got free rhythm on the violin part and normal 4/4 on the quartet parts. I could also, and then I can at any point I can now create a 3/4 time signature there, or an 11/8 time signature there. And again, I can do that. I can even do that here on the trumpet if I want to. I could do that, say, on maybe the two trumpet parts start playing together like that. Now, what you'll notice, one thing that Dorico cannot do, which is really annoying and which we will eventually address, is you cannot define the metric modulation between these two time signatures, which is a real limitation. So you might want to say that 3/4 should be the same length as 4/4. So it's effectively a sort of 3 in the time of 4 tuplet, effectively, in this stave, rather than, being quarter equals quarter between those two staves. But at the moment, the metric modulation is fixed. It's always quarter equals quarter. So if you did want to do that, then you would need to take a different approach. You would need to then create, just like you're used to probably in Finale and in other software, you'd go 3 in the time of 4 quarters, and then you would put in your music, and then you would hide those tuplets, which you can do by saying, don't show a number, don't show a bracket. You still get the signpost. And then you could add a cosmetic time signature, basically, in those staves. The other thing that you might want to do, which you can't do very easily at the moment, is you might want to, for example, have, I don't know, changing the number of stave lines for an individual instrument. You can't really do that. So you'd have to do you'd have to cheat. So you'd have to add a single line instrument to the violinist, I don't know, like a shaker or something. And then you would so this will be in page view. You won't see the shaker, of course. And then you could, to actually make it switch. So let's say that what you want to do is when the violin is playing, you want to see their stave. But when the violin is not playing, you want to see the other stave. So obviously you don't want to put any notes in on here. So what you do instead is you cheat. You tell Dorico, you can create something that won't appear really. So like a chord symbol region, which will be fine here because we're not going to show any chord symbols. And then you want to change the name of the shaker to be empty so that it doesn't show anything. Like that. And so now, whenever I want to switch back to the violin, so again, I might have, in this bar and this bar, I can just sort of, copy and paste this to go here. So that means that we'll start with the empty stave, and we could actually, extend that into the right spot, wherever that is. So you'll start there, and then whenever we then want to go back to the violin, again, we put the notes in here. And then again, you put another region on the lower stave when you want to go back to showing a single line stave. And if you don't want to show the bar rests, there's ways of getting rid of them. And again, it would be nice if all of this was much, much easier. So what we're planning to do in future versions is to make it so that you can, without having to muck around with extra instruments, change the number of stave lines used by an instrument. If you want to do a genuinely cutaway score, where, for example, that solo violinist is only appearing when they have music and otherwise nothing at all appears, not even a single line, you just see nothing, that will also be possible in a future version of Dorico. But again, at the moment, you'd have to employ weird tricks to get that to work. Likewise, if you want to do things like show, where there are points of synchronization between unmetered and metered music, like say, okay, well, the violin gets to this bit here on this downbeat, and then that happens to coincide with beat 3 of this bar. You can do that by creating vertical lines, but we'll have proper features to do that automatically in future as well.
I wrote a piece that has some instruments playing, or groups of instruments playing, aleatoric passages, but then the other groups of instruments, like the strings and maybe the woodwinds, are playing metered instruments, which means there's a conductor, and the conductor's going to, conduct those groups that are playing together metrically, but then you get these other groups that are playing aleatoric passages. So they've got to line up. Bunch of the players are going to be looking at the conductor to see where the downbeat is. The example you show here with a solo violin, you've got a 4/4 measure, then a 3/4 coming in, but he's going to get all confused because the conductor is in the middle of a measure there. So you've got these contradictory, signals, but you got to realize with a ensemble piece, you're going to have a conductor. If it's a lot of instruments, a chamber orchestra, for example. And
Barry, again,
yeah.
this is gonna take it's taking too long to describe. We're actually going to time out. We're going to lose the time that we have in this room. So I'm sorry. It sounds like a very big question. We just do not have time to cover it. But
yeah, no, I totally get where you're coming from, Barry. And I think there is, that what you can, as I sort of described, if you wanted to have a sort of synchronization point, then what you might do is, so for example, for the part, you might include a Q stave, and then that might show, material that is in the metrical stuff so that the unmetered players can see what they're doing, and that's very easy to do because you can just add one of those staves even into the part and make it cue sized. And you might also show some kind of coordination marking, so you could have arrows with that line up again for the conductor to cue those players. But as you say, that there's a lot of considerations, but basically what I was sort of trying to get across is that metered and unmetered music where you've got different time bases going on against each other, no problem. Dorico is going to have richer tools in the future for graphically communicating that more clearly. So things like cutaways, things like synchronization, coordination lines, queuing lines, frames for aleatoric material, all of that stuff will be there. We've sort of focused on more common practice notation, sort of up to the middle of the 20th century, and all that sort of avant-garde notation, the boundary pushing that was done by all those composers of the 40s and 50s and so on. Dorico can't really handle yet, but we're absolutely going to do those things. A lot of it is possible right now, although some of it's a bit kludgy, but there'll be more and more of that sort of expressive stuff coming in future versions, including in the next version of Dorico, which is coming relatively soon, although I can't say too much more about that at that point. So I'll
hush, hush.
yes,
Hush.
yes.
So
Yes.
as we're wrapping up here, Daniel, I just want to thank you very much. Don't be silly. I just want I just want to thank you for taking the time for this. We might have to have you back. Eric, I don't know.
No, please give me. I came here for one reason.
Turn the camera toward Eric.
Yes.
Let's hear Eric.
Yes. Hi, Daniel. Eric Highlander here. We've had some private emails back and forth over the years, and I just want to personally thank you for all the help you've been through all these years. And I just wanted to say, it seems like you're here constantly, like 24/7, 365. Are you ever taking any Daniel time to take a vacation? Just you need some personal time off, okay?
Believe it or not, I do manage to squeeze in quite a lot of music. This weekend, I was conducting my choir in a concert on Friday night. I was then and I'd already been at a film music workshop earlier in the day. I was then at a lovely film music concert with my daughter last night. I was leading the choir in church this morning for a baptism. So I'm pretty busy, but I'm not just sat behind my computer the whole time, I promise you. But thank you, Eric, for thanking me. I appreciate it very much. You know how long I've been working now for 25 plus years in this business, and the thing that I am still motivated by every single day is if I can personally, either through the work that I do on the software or even in answering a question of somebody in need, I absolutely want to do that. I am very personally speaking, I am motivated by wanting to bring more wonderful music into the world, and my own music is rubbish. But if I can help to be making and helping to make tools that allow other people to bring more beautiful music into the world, I will feel like I have left this planet having done something worthwhile. Hopefully, also raised a couple of kids and stuff as well. But it really is meaningful.
Kids thrown out into the world or something. But yeah. Speaking of kids, a father of, I don't know, 5 or 6, Kurt has one more question. You got to make it quick, Kurt.
Well, I mean, I hate to follow all that wonderful kind remarks with such a boring questions I have. But if it really just had to do, going back to the question I had about those incremental changes you can make to durations, whether or not Dorico can make diminutions and augmentations, but on a much, resulting in some very odd durations, if you like. If you could really adjust that type of thing, if that's an easy thing to do with Dorico. I was curious.
Yeah, so I haven't really shown any of the musical transformations you can do. There's a whole suite of, inversion, rotation, retrograde, all that kind of stuff. But the one thing that is a bit missing is sort of like applying as you say, augmentation and diminution of duration at something other than sort of power of 2. So what would be great, of course, is to be able to say, I want to take this by 5/4 and make it longer or shorter, that kind of thing. We do plan to add all of those kinds of features for sure, but you're a little bit limited in that regard at the moment.
It's actually a very recent thing, right? In a pretty recent version, you started like an equivalent of the canonic tools.
Yeah, version 4, I think it was. We added that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we definitely want to, because there's another, you may have come across this yourself, Kurt, in Doric already, that even things like just doubling and halving actually mess up tuplets because there's some extra work that we need to do there. But once we've tackled that issue, at that point we'll have a general purpose mechanism for augmentation and diminution by any amount. And so at that point we'll then be able to expand the all of those rhythmic tools to be able to do those kinds of interesting transformations as well. So again, it's definitely in our plans because, as I've said a couple of times, we really want Dorico to be, a full sort of composer's toolbox basically, and anything that you might want to do, that would otherwise you'd have to get out your slide rule and your calculator to figure it out. Obviously, the computer should be able to do it for you. So the goal is that we want to get Dorico to the point where it can do all of those things. But there's only a handful of us and many, many, many demands on our time, so it'll take a little while longer, but we will get there. We will get there.
Great. Well, thank you.
Daniel, thanks. You're a musical saint.
I wish.
It's fantastic. And it's a great program. I've been what's the word I'm looking? I've been pounding the desk for it for some years actually. And I've had people go, "Oh, nonsense." Well, you're proving the critics wrong. It's really superior. We didn't even get a chance to ask you what happened to Finale, but there really is no time.
Well, have me back. I will tell you. I'll tell you what I'm allowed to tell you in the future. It'll be my pleasure. I realized we didn't also do the finale conversion question, which I had wanted to do. But if you have an appetite to hear me talking for hours, I'm afraid I am perfectly capable of talking for hours. So if you'd like to do it again in future, I'd be very happy to come back anytime.
I'll be in touch. Thank you personally, and from New York Composer Circle, which is much larger than this. We've got like 50 members. Many people, it turned out, had something else going on. I could have picked a better date, but what are you gonna do?
No problem. No problem. I'd love to come back and tell you all about the new stuff in the new version of Dorico later in the year as well.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.